Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is April the 23rd, 2023. We've got a lot of 23s in today's date, and Agent Smith is going to break down what is going on in the world to the best of his ability. Without any further delays, let's begin World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty chillin'. How are you?
Oh, you know how I am. You got my text message earlier.
Who was that meant for?
Oh, I had a family member going out to go get some food for us.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I got that order and I was like, I don't know how I can get that to you. I don't even have your address. Agent Smith preferred to be paid in food for this episode today.
Yeah, my apologies.
All good.
It's not the first time that's happened either.
Yeah.
Yeah, normally I don't eat that much just before we start this, but today we had a pretty light breakfast, so.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What's a normal breakfast for you? Is that funny? I don't know why that's funny. Maybe it's funny.
It varies wildly. I don't have anything consistent. So sometimes it's pretty good. Sometimes it's just junk food. So sometimes not much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's too much variance for me to really have any kind of consistent, to have any kind of answer to that would really cover everything.
Mm-hmm. Because I know some people are breakfast skippers. If you're a breakfast skipper most of the time, press 1 in the chat. If you have breakfast every day and it's the same thing, press 4 in the chat. And if you're like Agent Smith and God knows what you have, it's a dice roll, press 9. I'm in the 4 category. I have oatmeal with some kind of fruit and also protein powder and chia seeds basically every morning. And I just rotate the fruit to make it slightly different. Coffee and a cigarette is not breakfast. But it may be a morning ritual.
That's a working man's breakfast.
Yeah. Industrial Revolution breakfast. Get to the factories at 5 a.m. Back to work. We did a cool segment yesterday with Fuzzy Cord, who often handles questions for us during Agent Smith. But he's I would say, like, very high-level music hobbyist when it comes to music theory and also being able to play different stuff. So he was showing us the different kinds of instruments that exist, the categories of those, and how they generate sound, and then also synthesizers and how they generate sound. It was a pretty awesome time.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
I think you did a thing with Eche Fatum recently, too, didn't you?
Yeah, we did the philosophy of woke, which was our spiciest episode yet, I think, because a lot of people are strongly activated by that word based on how it's thrown around to refer to a lot of different kinds of attention to social issues. It can be used as like a scapegoating tool, more or less. I know, like, some people who don't think that the pursuit of these civil rights or issues and so on, they'll call it like woke garbage or whatever. I've seen those words paired together. Yeah, we live in interesting times, and outrage media is another thing that we talked about a bunch, and I referenced your phrase that I love now, which is performative outrage, where you're a person who has some kind of political stake in a situation and you have a base, and your base expects you to be outraged by something. And maybe you have some deals with them. And one of the really funny, I could say, manifestations of performative outrage lately has been Bud Light. Bud Light did a campaign with a transgender, like, social media personality person, influencer, whatever. And there's a Bud Light can that has her face on it. Cool, fine, whatever. That's a thing. But that upset a lot of people who aren't, like, on board with the trans rights and all that kind of stuff, and they got really pissed. And it was really funny. Donald Trump's son was sort of doing the performative outrage And he did it in such a really silly way because Budweiser, the company, has given a lot to conservative campaign funds and that kind of thing. And what he did to deflect some of the pressure on Bud Light was to call them out for like pushing the woke garbage, whatever. That's the performative outrage. And then he followed it up with, but it's not as bad as the other alcohol companies. They're doing way worse. So he kind of circled back to try to help them rebound a little bit because it benefits him personally.
Of course.
So, a really good example there of performative outrage. Maybe you're mad, maybe you're not, but your base expects you to be mad, so you need to make some strong statements. The example that I gave Eche Fatum was the leaked spy documents and how a lot of the allies of the U.S., whenever that news came out, they have to be outraged to their base and like speak strongly to the U.S. blah blah blah. But then basically just get back to whatever our alliance was before because everyone spies on everyone anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
It sounds unseemly, but it's an unseemly world.
Yeah.
Very frequently.
There is a lot of performance art to being a successful politician for sure. Because it's about getting people's emotions to do certain things to benefit you in some way. And also in a way to benefit them if you're thinking about like the value of being justifiably angry about something. If there are injustices, for you to be upset about that and to push for change, it's totally valid. And that's an important kind of mechanism that we can be motivated by. But then you have to moderate that and make sure that you're not just outraged by everything all the time, because then you're just an angry person and it's not really about the issues anymore. You're just mad permanently.
Not a particularly healthy state.
Yeah. Politician and actor require the same skill set. Yeah, what's your quote that what is it? Politics is Hollywood for ugly people or something?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the paraphrased version of it. I don't remember what the original quote was, but that's the gist of it.
Any politicians, hope you don't take that personally.
Well, if they do, they won't show it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're playing a role. You know, you're trying to kind of channel people's energy, you know, be it prejudice, hate, or love, or activism, or, you know, whatever it is that they're feeling. They want to see that in their politicians. And because we're not telepaths, we can't really know what a given politician is really thinking. And so that creates room for people to be opportunistic. You know, you can run for office and try to win votes just by pretending, which is why politicians, well, part of the reason anyway, that politicians have the reputation for lying. They very rarely truly represent what they actually feel about this, that, or the other issue, because that's not optimal strategy, right? If you want to win office, it doesn't make sense to kind of be honest, because odds are being honest means you're just going to alienate people, at least some segment of the population. And, you know, if you want to win, there's no reason to do that. You can just pretend to believe something that you don't in order to try to maximize the number of people who are willing to vote for you. Yeah, that's how politics in the United States has been for a very long time. It's gotten a little harder to do just because the country's gotten bigger and more diverse. So at this point, creating coalitions that cross, you know, maybe dozens of different groups requires you to take such a bland, innocuous position on such a range of topics that people kind of know that you're bullshitting them. That's one of the, we've talked about it before, right? I mean, that's one of the problems Hillary Clinton had. You know, she was kind of doing focus group politics. Everything she said and the way she presented herself were very strategic, right? She was optimizing her presentation to try to maximize her appeal across a given segment of strategically chosen constituencies. And she was pretty effective in that overall. But I mean, the overall effect, though, was that she just came across as really, really bland, you know, just very inoffensive. And, you know, while that works to maintain broad coalitions, it's not going to be something anybody's really passionate about.
Yeah. You're not really winning people's hearts. Like you can, you can sell them like why you're the least bad candidate, but you're not getting the passionate voters. And I feel like the passionate voters are much lower in number, but they have more of a bearing on media and stuff because they're the ones who are putting a higher effort into politics than people who are kind of apathetic, somewhat disconnected. Like their opinions matter too, but they're not shouting them from the streets. So it felt like people who are taking the strategy of Hillary Clinton, they're not winning those really passionate voters. They're like getting the people, I guess, in the middle who are like really low risk. But in today's political climate, you definitely need to win some of the like really passionate people too.
Yeah. Yeah, and the passionate also have the advantage of participating more.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people just kind of do the bare minimum and maybe show up on election day. But if you really want to participate, you got to be voting in primaries. You need to be maybe not running for office, but, kind of tracking who's running for office in local elections, participating in, city hall type stuff. There's a whole range of political activity that does not involve actual voting, but which is still important to the health and maintenance of a democratic political system. So, for better or worse, the passionate kind of monopolize that activity. They tend to be disproportionately present in those kinds of non-voting type political activities. And so between that and the fact that they disproportionately show up for primaries, their voice and opinions are disproportionately weighted in the calculus of politicians who are trying to figure out how best to win office.
Yeah, because there is a substantial block of voters in every country who simply don't give a fuck.
That's always the dominant voting bloc, pretty much.
Yeah. They don't really have a stake in a political party in particular. Maybe they're kind of disappointed in the system in general. And that's a pretty large margin. It's hard to get them to do as much, though, because they don't really have faith that their vote matters. And that's, I guess, where there is some personal belief of, is it worth my time to go out and do this? And it does cost people something, like to go out and vote. I think most companies, maybe people in chat can weigh in, but they don't give you a paid day off. You would have to take time, like skip your lunch or sacrifice something to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no election holiday in the U.S. Somewhat paradoxically.
Yeah. We're all about democracy, but you better figure out how you're going to get to vote.
Yeah. Well,
mail voting is really good.
Yeah. Yeah, we do that. Yeah, that is an advantage. Although I would point out it ceases to be paradoxical if you actually, read U.S. history. It makes a lot more sense then. But yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's just hard to kind of maintain those systems, given that there's sort of this broader disinterest. Where that disinterest stems from is debatable. You could argue on the one hand that maybe it's down to contentment. Things are sufficiently good in the U.S. that people don't really care enough to kind of learn the nuts and bolts of the political system. When people are really pissed off about something, then they'll kind of get up and do something. We've seen that, on certain occasions, on certain issues, usually individual issues. But, if that's the case, then we can infer then that, the fact that they're not doing that suggests that they're sufficiently content with the status quo that they can't be bothered. So that's a more favorable reading. But then you could also argue that maybe the fact that the country has gotten so big and diverse that political coalitions are now just too big, basically, to facilitate dramatic change of almost any kind, at least not without undermining the coalition that would be necessary in order to pass that kind of dramatic change of whatever kind it may be. And, if that is accurate, that means that dramatic change is de facto ruled out just systemically, given the status quo. And if that's the case, then people are basically just discouraged, kind of like what you said. If there is no realistic chance for dramatic change, and dramatic change is what you really want, then what sense is there in participating? Like the only changes are going to be incremental or probably just symbolic. And that may not be a sufficient threshold to mobilize people to vote and participate in the political system. So that's a more cynical interpretation. Take your pick. You know, as I've said before on here, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. So these are just different interpretations that you can take or leave as you like. Yeah, that might be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So, you know, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. You know, chat is encouraged to participate in that regard. I won't see chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So, you know, I will get the feedback.
So we did talk about this briefly last time. Chat had another question about Peter Zehan, who is a YouTuber who talks about a lot of big picture stuff. They were wondering if you had a take on his overall thesis in the book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I don't know what that thesis is, though.
Neither do I.
No.
What was it called?
The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
Is that his most recent one?
No idea. Wasn't specified.
All right. I'm bringing it up. I don't know what the thesis is, so I can't answer the question, but I pretty consistently get Zehan questions now for some reason. Because we got some last time too.
Yeah.
June 2022. Okay, so that is pretty recent. How much is this? Why is every book on Amazon like $30?
I don't know.
There must be some goofy economic reason for that will piss me off. Well, it's not going to be like a good reason, right? It's going to be some bullshit, you know, monopoly type thing. You know, economists don't like monopolies. And Amazon is kind of notorious for cornering markets at this point. It should be lower. There should be more competition than that. Books really shouldn't cost all that much. It certainly doesn't cost that much to make them.
Agent Smith with a hot take of books are too expensive.
I don't want to pay $18 for it, though. There really got to be something like a Steam sale for books, or a humble bundle for books.
Any cliff notes in the chat of what that's about?
Actually, they do have book bundles sometimes, but usually it's like graphic novels or stuff like that. I'll try to read it. I need to read it just so that I can answer some of these damn questions.
Yeah.
I have seen some of his free stuff on YouTube. Like he's done some seminars and stuff. So I did read that to try to get a feel for some of his argumentation. But of course, there's no substitute for like literature.
Yeah.
You know, invariably the argumentation will be much more fleshed out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gave a critique of Zehan the last time we did this. So, you know, if you're interested, I would refer to that just kind of for my general thoughts on Zehan. But this person is asking specifically about the thesis in the book. So again, I can't answer that.
But I think the short version of what you were talking about last time was he takes a very broad brush, if you will, when it comes to talking about geopolitics in the world, in the sense that it's so broad that it's hard to really know how accurate he's being. Because it's just such a huge scale of unprecedented stuff. And it's pretty palatable to people who aren't experts in the field. So it's nice for lay people to just get a sense of the big picture.
Yeah, it's a good. He'll give you a good introduction. You know, he'll kind of discuss facts that are relevant in the professional community of analysts. But the thing is that he'll just take some of those facts and then just extrapolate them into the future. And some of the assumptions he makes in doing so are a little debatable, to put it mildly. So, you know, the overall quality of the analysis that he does with those facts, that's more where I'm a little more critical. But if you are just looking for the facts that you can kind of draw your own conclusions, he's pretty decent at that. You know, you will learn useful information reading Zehan stuff. So I don't want to discourage people from reading him, but I would just encourage people to approach his work with a critical mind. You know, just don't take it on faith. And if you really want to get into stuff like geopolitics or regional studies or history or whatnot, then I would definitely encourage people to find more professional sources, because there are analysts who basically just build entire careers out of stuff like that, generally out of specific regions. Zehan is kind of a generalist. He talks about, all of the regions. He kind of tries to cover everything. But if you want to get like the detailed analysis with more insight, you would definitely have to look more at the work of a regional expert. And those guys are out there. A lot of them are on Twitter. So, you don't even necessarily have to spend a lot of money to kind of get some of their insights. They're pretty happy to, they're pretty much happy to have anybody listen to them, given how niche a lot of their subject matter is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the things that I learned just kind of not going for a PhD, but learning what it would take to go for one, and how the deeper you go toward expertise in a given field, the more specific you have to be if you're actually making sure that you know what you're talking about. So, yeah, pretty tough to like look at the entire world and make big claims and assumptions and that kind of thing. There's just so much going on.
Yeah, just speaking in terms of economics, like a PhD in economics is not somebody who has mastered all of the economics, right? There's nobody does that. Nobody knows all of the economics out there, like all of the research, all of the literature. You have to pick a specific field, and that's going to be your field of expertise. And you can kind of, do some other stuff. You can kind of dabble. But odds are, like, just staying current in your field and producing new research in your field is going to take all of your time. Other than like teaching and other sort of peripheral type activity that'll be a part of whatever job you're having. But beyond that, yeah, like you're just not going to have the time to expand outside of your field that much. Your best opportunity to do that is to do something like collaborative work, where you maybe do something with, well, basically interdisciplinary stuff. You find somebody else from a different field, and then you find like a research question that kind of overlaps your two fields, and then you can kind of do that, and then you get some exposure to the other field, and that way you can kind of branch out a little bit. But for the most part, yeah, you're pretty well siloed. It can be very hard to break out. Although I did meet one guy who actually got a PhD specializing in what turned out to be a dead field, which was unfortunate for him, the way he was talking about it. I think he was doing something like the economics of taxes. And, he found it very interesting. And when he was studying it, it was more current. But then by the time he'd graduated, like the field just sort of died out. It was not like a new dynamic field anymore. And there was not a lot of publishing opportunities. And of course, if you want to be an academic, it's publish or perish, right? You have to publish work in order to keep your job. And so the fact that he had specialized in a dead field put him in a very awkward position where that became very hard to do. So the circumstances that he was in basically forced him to branch out into another field. He had little choice in the matter. But unless you're in like a weird circumstance like he was in, probably you will stay within your field for a good chunk of your career. Not necessarily all of it, but a good chunk of it.
Why did economics of taxes become a dead field?
There weren't any new good research questions on it. Like all of the big questions had been asked and explored. That's not to say that they had solved all of the big problems, but they had gone as far as they could with the available data. There's only so much you can do to answer a question with available data and methodologies. And, once you it's possible for a field to just hit a wall at some point. Like there comes a point when you've studied the question with every possible methodology and with all of the data you have. And after that, you just need new data or new techniques to study it. And if those are not forthcoming, then you're just kind of stuck. And there's just nowhere for the field to go at that point. Yeah, I once knew a professor, he was a professor of one of my classes in grad school, and he was telling us that he actually knew when there was like a new release of new data in a given field. that he knew immediately what that data would be used for and what kinds of papers would be published with it. And he didn't have to wait to like see where they would go, like just based off of his background knowledge of the literature in his field. Like he just knew immediately what kinds of questions the data would be used to explore, and it, by extension, what kind of literature would be produced as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So you really get a very strong intuitive feel for research questions and methodologies when you specialize in a field.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it possible for you to really just be able to project pretty far into the future, like 5 to 10 years, how a given field will kind of look and how the papers that are published in it will look, just based off of available data. Right. So that's a kind of restraint, basically. In other words, given that there's only so much you can do with data and methodologies, if you know the data and methodologies, then you know what kinds of questions and papers will be published.
Today in Agent Smith, turns out research is harder than you thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Odds are, if you have an interesting research question as a new grad student who has not really explored the literature of your field, there's probably already been papers on it. That was my experience. I came in with some questions that I wanted to explore, and I thought they were innovative and new, and I get in and found out that not only had those questions all been thoroughly explored and answered, they'd already been explored like decades ago. So I was just way behind the curve.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge body of literature in pretty much any, field of academia, but, also economics, the one that I was studying. And it's got a lot of depth to it. And, because questions, because given fields and questions kind of fall by the wayside over time, it's easy to think that a given question has not been explored when it actually has, just because a lot of the stuff being debated in economics is newer stuff that's more current and relevant. So just because the field, or especially the media, is not talking about a given question or a certain idea that you may have, that doesn't mean it hasn't been explored before. It may mean that it's been explored so thoroughly that there's no point in talking about it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So don't judge academics too harshly if they're not focusing on something you're interested in. It's probably the case that they've just already done that and don't care anymore. Mm-hmm. In which case, it would behoove you to kind of dig into Google Scholar and try to find the work that was done on it. Mm-hmm. You may find it very interesting and enlightening.
So the big item that people were talking about in chat before we started was Sudan.
Yep. Yeah, I thought it would be. Yeah, it's have you followed it at all?
No.
Okay. Where do you want to start with, just like the recent stuff, or do you want me to kind of give the background?
Yeah, sure. Recent stuff is cool.
Okay. So I think it was 2 weeks ago, fighting broke out in the capital and then rapidly spread outside of the capital to the rest of the country. And so effectively, there is a civil war happening in Sudan at this point. And it's actually not that surprising. I had actually been reading, I have like newsletters and stuff that I occasionally follow just to kind of keep an eye on certain, regions and issues. And one of them I read like a week before the fighting started said that there was a lot of suspicious deployments taking place that suggested that fighting might be imminent.
Mm-hmm.
And so it turns out that was prophetic. So a lot of the experts that kind of follow the Middle East and Sudan in particular kind of predicted that. Mm-hmm. They were hoping it wouldn't happen, but obviously that didn't pan out. So here we are. It's not a civil war in the sense that it's the people rising up to kind of establish their rights, overthrow the military government, what have you. This is actually the kind of civil war that's defined by intra-elite competition, which is to say that there are two basically factions within the authoritarian government there that are fighting each other for power. Mm-hmm. The people are basically just marginalized here. They're kind of spectators at this point. which is unfortunate, but that's just the reality right now. We'll see who wins. I don't think civilians are going to like either outcome, but I suspect that they're going to prefer the military government that was already in control over the other faction that they're fighting, which is I think it's the Rapid Response Forces. Let's see, Sudan Rapid Support Forces. Okay, the Rapid Support Forces. So if you haven't ever heard of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, you probably actually have heard of them. So Neuro, you might be a little young to remember, but do you remember the genocide in Darfur?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, so Darfur is a province in Western Sudan. Some of the older people listening will probably remember this because the media, the 90s was kind of a slow news decade in a lot of ways. And so kind of near the end of the 90s, a lot of reporters in the international news beat kind of homed in on the violence in Darfur. And so that ended up being headline news for a long time in the United States up until, 9/11. So there is a province in Western Sudan called Darfur. And back sort of in the late 90s or so, the locals in Darfur came under attack by nomadic cavalrymen, basically militiamen that were de facto working for the government. They were also kind of working on their own, but the government has supported them. And part of the problem was just, climate change, changes in weather patterns, what have you. I mean, it would be a very familiar story for anybody living in like the Sahel right now. You have herders losing their traditional grazing land because of desertification or lack of rain or what have you. And so they move into territories that are being tilled by farmers, and then they clash for control of resources like water, land, etc. So some of that was going on, but there was also just old-fashioned expansionism and also a little bit of racism, since a lot of the natives in Darfur are not really Arab, or at least are much less Arab anyway than the nomadic cavalrymen that were kind of preying on them. And the Arab world has some issues with racism. It's not, you don't see it a whole lot, but there is history there on that count. And Sudan is historically kind of a front line in that regard, because Sudan is sort of a border region between the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa. But anyway, the sort of Arab nomadic militiamen were supported by the government because there was some, I think, separatist sentiment in Darfur, if I'm remembering correctly. And so the militiamen were seen as natural allies in that, and so the government supported them, and the result was a significant amount of ethnic violence between the cavalry and the nomadic peoples, I should say, and the native farmer population. This is like Cliff Notes version of this, by the way, so don't read too much into it, but that's like a base review. So the nomadic militia that the government supported was called the Janjaweed. And Janjaweed kind of came up a lot, in the international news back in the late 90s. That's a word you would have been familiar with if you read the news a lot at the time. And so the Janjaweed, even after the conflict ended, did not disband. They continued to exist as a coherent military unit. And eventually, because they had gotten pretty powerful, relatively speaking, they became a powerful tool in the toolkit of the president. Because within the Sudanese government, there was basically two major powers. One of them was the presidency, which was held by, I think his name was Omar, if I'm not mistaken. And the other major power block was the military. So, to kind of go back to the 1980s, the military seized power in the 1980s in a coup. And then they kind of created a sort of fake civilian government that was led by Omar. But then Omar eventually kind of maneuvered his way into a more powerful position where he had a lot more discretion and kind of had an equal footing with the military. And that lasted until 2019, when mass protests in Sudan demanding democratization undermined the legitimacy of Omar's government to the point where he was kicked out. But of course, that didn't really change the fundamental fact that the military was the real power in the country. And so nothing really of substance ended up changing. There was a power sharing agreement made in which there was supposed to be a transition to democracy. And that involved the military holding the transitional government for the first 2 years, and then the presidency would be handed over to civilian leaders for the second 2 years. And then after that, there would be an election and then a formal transition to democracy. So you can probably guess what happened, right? So the military held their term of 2 years in control of the transitional government. And then at the end of that 2 year term, they just ended it. They just scrapped the whole agreement and said, hey, we're not giving you any power. We were just fucking with you. Joke's on you. So no great surprise there. It was disappointing. I was kind of trying to be optimistic about it when it happened. But really, that was always probably the most likely outcome. So that is what ended up happening. And that happened in, I want to say, 2021, when the military government ended the transitional government and just basically seized power again. And since then, there's been pretty consistent on again, off again protests, because of course the civilian protesters and civil society and whatnot, they're very unhappy with that. They thought they were finally transitioning to democracy, and then they had the rug pulled out from under them. So they've been protesting, trying to put pressure on the government. It hasn't really worked. But the government has also been struggling with things like inflation and whatnot. So they haven't really had the power to completely crack down and just restore stability either. So Sudan has been caught in a very uncomfortable position between civil society pushing for change and then the military government refusing to give it, but unable to crack down. So the country's been pretty unstable for the past couple years, correspondingly. Now, to go back to the rapid support forces, so the Janjaweed, that militia I mentioned, because they were pretty powerful, the president, President Omar, saw them as a useful Praetorian Guard, which is to say that they were basically his own personal military. And by acting as his personal military, he was able to gain more leverage over the actual military as far as political decision making in Sudan. And so eventually what happened is that they ceased being like just an informal militia that was aligned with President Omar, and instead were formally incorporated into the government in the form of a paramilitary organization that was formally controlled by the state, and specifically the president, which was called the Rapid Support Forces. So the Rapid Support Forces are just the Janjaweed, only with a label attached to them. Technically we're legal now. And that was not enough to prevent President Omar from losing power. Again, the protests were sufficiently widespread and the military sufficiently disinterested in going to bat for Mr. Omar that he was ejected from the presidency. Now, that said, the Janjaweed, that is to say the Rapid Support Forces, they did not leave with the president. They actually continued to exist. And basically, there was kind of a standoff during and after the protests in 2019. Where both the military and the Rapid Support Forces were a little unsure if they would have to fight each other, because obviously the RSF was still technically loyal to the president that had just been outed. So what happened is they kind of negotiated a deal, and that deal was the same one that was negotiated with the civilians that had been protesting, right? So they created a transitional government. The military had representation in the transitional government, the civilian leadership had representation, but interestingly, the Rapid Support Forces also had representation in that transitional government. So effectively, there were three factions in that transitional government. And so rather than trying to dismember, or disband rather, the RSF, or otherwise trying to kind of integrate them into the formal military so that they would cease being a countervailing center of power within Sudanese politics, they basically just became a faction unto themselves, right? So they superseded the President Omar, whom basically no longer matters, and are effectively competing for power within Sudanese politics. So that created an uneasy peace for a year and a half, roughly, a year or two. But more recently, there had been more talk about trying to kind of settle the country down by giving some kind of concessions to the civilians and otherwise kind of completing the transition that had been started back in 2019. most likely the military is not being entirely genuine about making promises in that regard, but they were looking at trying to make some kind of progress there. And it was not entirely clear just what kind of role the rapid support forces would play in that. And so what happened is that over the past 6 months to a year in particular, both the military and the RSF have started trying to build themselves up in anticipation of a potential conflict between themselves. They were probably hoping that they could talk it out and maybe reach some kind of agreement where, resources could be allocated to everybody's satisfaction, such that they didn't feel they had to fight over it. But obviously, those negotiations have failed, and as a result, now the rapid support forces and the military are in open, violent conflict with each other. Presumably, they're fighting over control of the government, so one or the other will come out on top. It's also possible, though, that this is just the RSF's way of exerting pressure, right? There isn't any inherent reason why a negotiation has to stay peaceful. You can also negotiate through violence. So obviously, if the military crushes the RSF outright, that doesn't really work. But it could be that the military doesn't really have the power to crush them completely. And if that's the case, then they're eventually going to have to negotiate some kind of settlement. So if the RSF can put sufficient pressure on the military and maybe take some ground here and there to the point where, trying to defeat them outright would not be worth the trouble. In that case, the RSF could get a pretty decent deal, in which case the fighting would make sense. It would be worth it. So that's also a possible outcome here. I would guess it's more the latter than the former. I don't really think that this is going to be like a civil war that just gets fought to the last man, either by the military or the RSF. I imagine that they're going to fight for a while, and then eventually one or the other party is going to buckle, and then there's going to be some kind of peace agreement. I would point out here that in this struggle, the civilians that were protesting and civil society in the country basically don't really matter that much. They don't have any kind of armed wing that they can deploy to compete with power violently with either the military or the RSF. So they've been pretty thoroughly marginalized at this point.
That sucks.
Well, that's pretty much been the fate of almost all of the major protests that happened in 2019, which, to be fair, is pretty much what I predicted at the time. I probably sounded like a cynical asshole when I was talking about it, but, realistically, it's just very hard to achieve change using, mass protests and whatnot. It takes a lot more than that, and I didn't see the necessary prerequisite organization amongst most of the 2019 protests. So, yeah, I mean, if you remember, it wasn't just Sudan, it was also Hong Kong, Lebanon, Chile, to a lesser degree, Iran. All of those countries had big protests in 2019, and basically they haven't really gone anywhere since then. Hong Kong famously so, but even Chile, somewhat surprisingly, ended up not really getting anything out of it. The protests there in 2019 were about a new constitution. Well, actually, they were about inequality, but the protesters were demanding a new constitution anyway. And the government actually, conceded that and did agree, and they did have elections for positions in a constitutional Congress, and that Congress was convened to negotiate a new constitution, and a new constitution was written. So it seemed like the protesters were going to get what they wanted. But then when it came time for Chile's actual Congress to vote on the new constitution, they actually voted it down. And so that process seems to have been mostly for nothing. So you can put another notch in the lose column there for 2019 protests in that regard. Yeah, Lebanon and Iran obviously haven't gone anywhere. Both of those are really struggling, especially Lebanon. And Hong Kong, Hong Kong, like I mentioned, everybody knows what happened there. So yeah, not a great track record, unfortunately. So
not the best results for protests. Chat was asking if the Wagner Group is helping one of the sides in the Sudan conflict.
Yeah, technically, I think they're more on the side of the military government, but honestly, I don't think they really give a shit. For them, it's more about the gold. As corny as that sounds, Wagner Group is basically turning into Spectre, from the James Bond movies.
Uh-huh.
That's basically what they're doing at this point. It's like a paramilitary criminal organization that is pilfering, developing countries for their own benefit. I think mercenaries are just the tip of the iceberg, right? Everybody knows about Wagner Group mercenaries and how they've deployed to help countries in Africa fight, jihadis or separatists or, what have you. But what they want, generally what they get in exchange for providing those services, be it, training or, actual direct kinetic action, what they get in exchange for that is frequently mining rights. That is to say that they get the right to exploit natural resources of one kind or another in the host country. So, they're also paid in addition to that, but a lot of the compensation comes in the form of commodities. And in case of Sudan, the main commodity that they've gotten the rights to is gold. So, I don't know exactly the extent of Wagner Group's deployment to Sudan. I don't think it's one of their bigger ones. So I think it's more just an advisory role in the case of Sudan, where they advise and train Sudanese troops. But in addition to doing that, they're also extracting gold and then smuggling it out. Maybe not smuggling it out. I think technically it is legal, but they can't go through, some countries' airspaces and whatnot. And so, yeah, they export gold out of Sudan back to Russia for use by the Russian government. You can probably guess what they use it for. It's nothing that's going to please Ukrainians. But yeah, Wagner Group is present, but I don't think that they're really leaning into the conflict that much, at least given what I've read of the conflict thus far. Yeah, Wagner Group mercenaries are much more present in Mali and Burkina Faso. I think those are their largest overseas deployments right now. There might still be some in Syria too, but fighting has kind of died down there over time. So I don't know that there's a big deployment there anymore.
Speaking of Ukraine, was there anything different or interesting that happened recently?
Some stuff, but nothing really big happening in terms of like the course of the war. I think the big thing that I've been reading in Ukraine outlets is that everybody's pretty much waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive at this point. The Russian winter offensive has petered out, and so the question now is, will the Ukrainians counterattack, and if they do, where will they counterattack? But they haven't done it yet, so we'll see. Yeah, not a lot of big moves happening in terms of military activity in Ukraine lately. They did have some. I just had some other miscellaneous stuff. There was what was it? I read an article about. No, it was. I think it was ISW, and they were quoting a think tank in the UK talking about Russian activity in occupied territories in Ukraine. And they were talking about some of the tactics that the FSB has been using there. And from what they were saying, the FSB has been fairly effective in establishing control over occupied territories. The FSB is a lot more professional than the Russian army, so that's not necessarily surprising. Although it's unfortunate. They're not doing it nicely, unfortunately. One of the things that they did is download government computer hard drives that they were able to acquire in order to try to identify former public servants or just other individuals in occupied territories who they suspect were or were suspected to be pro-Ukrainian in outlook. And those people were arrested and interrogated, as you would expect. They didn't necessarily kill them per se, but apparently torture was pretty normal And the interesting thing I read is that torture was not so much used to extract information because they didn't really expect, torture is not a very good means to get information. Everybody kind of knows that. In this case, torture was used more to try to intimidate the local population into compliance. And they have reached, had some success in that regard. But let's see, there was also usage of electronic warfare units in order to try to cut off access to outside media, so outside television and outside radio, stuff like that. You can't really get it. It's not as accessible in occupied Ukraine now because of Russian jamming. And again, they do that specifically to try to cut off people in the occupied territories from Ukrainian media, as well as just, all outside media in general. And I thought this was interesting. One of the FSB guys was apparently found to have asserted that you only need to control 8% of the population in an area to subdue that area.
What does it mean, control, in this context? Like have working for you, or?
They were a little ambiguous about that. So either controlling in the sense that they're directly working for you, or sufficiently cow into submission.
Mm-hmm.
One or the other, depending on it. But 8% is not high either way.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a little low, which kind of made me suspicious about the veracity of the statement.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of referencing the voting and political investment conversation we were having at the start, a lot of people are basically just trying to get by and do their job, and who's in charge, politically speaking, doesn't really matter a ton to them. Like, not everyone's job is affected by which party is ruling or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would guess that the number might be lower than we would expect because of that phenomenon of just people not really being that invested in those outcomes. But yeah, 8% seems like kind of a random number to throw out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Like we were talking earlier, a lot of people are pretty passive and neutral in the grand scheme of things,
Mm-hmm.
even in the context of a, violent invasion. Yeah, there's actually another example of that within the United States in its history, which was the American Civil War. The American Civil War was is the most violent conflict in the history of the United States. There's more Americans died in the Civil War than in all other American wars combined. And yeah, despite that fact, most people during the American Civil War were not really all that interested.
Mm-hmm.
There was definitely a lot of passionate people, in favor of one side or the other, either North or South. But probably the largest faction were people who were just neutral, people
Mm-hmm.
who just didn't really want to get involved that much. Let's see. So this same source also argued that, also asserted, I should say, that the Russians, the FSB specifically, had a pretty decent sized network of agents in Ukraine prior to the invasion, which, not that big a surprise, considering that there's a decent amount of pro-Russian sentiment in eastern Ukraine in particular. So apparently they built up those networks in anticipation of the invasion by setting up quote-unquote temporary operational groups that were focused on very particular areas, such as the city of Melitopol in southern Ukraine. So that was part of the reason, anyway, for some of the Russian success in the south of Ukraine earlier in the conflict. They did have some local assistants that had been recruited by the FSB ahead of time. Yeah, the FSB has had some problems, though. They did list, apparently the FSB has just basically become a yes man for Putin. They don't really criticize him or push back on some of the dumb shit that he asks about. The assessment in the lead up to the invasion was that, the Russians would be greeted with open arms, which should sound very familiar to any Americans that perhaps remember the lead up to the Iraq War. That we had a very similar expectation here. So the FSB really dropped the ball on that one, and apparently some of that just had to do with not wanting to contradict the Tsar. You know, they didn't really want to push back that hard on him, so they just kind of told him what he wanted to hear. They've apparently also obfuscated failures and other weaknesses in the agency. So that's more of an institutional culture type thing, although that seems to have gotten worse, you know, they say. So just a little snapshot of some intelligence agency activity in occupied Ukraine. So did you hear about the, there was an assassination in St. Petersburg. Did you hear about that a couple weeks ago?
I did not.
Have you heard of mill bloggers?
Mill bloggers? No.
Yeah, military bloggers.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of Russian military bloggers and running around Ukraine, basically. You know, they, because they're pro-government and pro-war, the government actually kind of gives them a longer leash, so to speak. You know, they have a lot more discretion in where they go and what they report. Mm-hmm. So they've gotten to be pretty well known. You know, not only inside Russia but also outside, because they tend to have privileged access, and they tend to also have relatively more discretion in how much they can criticize the government and the war effort, because they are pro-war. They're not coming, you know, that criticism that they give is not coming from a source of anti-war sentiment. You know, they want the government to fix the problems and actually win the war, which is why they report on them. Mm-hmm. So because that's where they're coming from, the government doesn't like punish them or crack down on them. You know, they're seen as nationalists, which is a core constituency for the Putin government. So one of these guys was particularly famous. I don't have his name in front of me, but he was holding like a rally of some kind in a St. Petersburg cafe. And, you know, while he was there kind of talking in front of the crowd, somebody gave him a parcel, just kind of walked up to him and gave him what they said was a gift. And inside the parcel was a little statue. And, you know, he said, okay, you know, thank you. That's very nice, and kind of set it down. And then it just exploded.
Whoa.
Just killed him dead right there.
Damn.
And injured a whole shit ton of people as well. It wasn't like a small explosion. You know, it went off in the middle of the cafe while everybody was there listening to this guy. And that was pretty much an outright assassination. That we don't really have like all of the information right now, but given what we know, it seems like it was just an outright assassination by possibly anti-war people in Russia, but also, you know, you can't entirely rule out that it might be SBU, you know, Ukrainian intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's a little hard to judge. They actually caught the woman who gave him the statue already, but I don't think we've gotten a whole lot of information about what she said or admitted to yet. Even if we did, I don't know if we can even trust it that much. But regardless, they did catch her, and she is under arrest. Mm. So more violence in Russia, basically. That seems to be a recurring theme since the war started. Well, I guess it was kind of a recurring theme even before, but especially since the war started. I guess this isn't really news here, but so in Latvia, you know, which is one of the Baltic states in Europe, they've been seizing cars from drunks and then sending the cars to Ukraine in order to help them with the war effort. Yeah, not really news per se, just some weird trivia for you. Let's see. Yeah, we don't really need that. Oh, the IMF gave Ukraine $16 billion. Well, a $16 billion package, sorry.
What's the IMF again?
International Monetary Fund.
Oh, thank you.
It's one of the two major institutions created by the Bretton Woods, created as part of the Bretton Woods system, which came out of a conference in Bretton Woods in the late 1940s after World War II. Both institutions were designed to try to provide greater stability to international trade, commerce, and finance. The other one was the World Bank. So the World Bank was designed more to give development money to developing countries to help them kind of improve their economies and develop. The IMF was more focused on international financial flows, as well as things like sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is pretty much the main thing they're known for. So countries that borrow money and then maybe get into debt trouble, they go to the IMF, not the World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you go to the World Bank if you want to build like a dam or a highway or something like that, you know, something that's like a development project. That's more what the World Bank is about. If you're defaulting on your loans and you need a bailout, then you go to the IMF. So Ukraine obviously has money problems right now since their economy is kind of getting scrambled by, you know, barrages of Russian cruise missiles, occupation of territory, etc. So they've gone to the IMF to try to get some money to help them get through the hard times. And the IMF was actually willing to give them a $16 billion package, which is unusual because the IMF had never before given money to a country that was at war. That's actually new. There wasn't necessarily a rule against it per se, but you know, if you're trying to help a country stabilize its finances, not necessarily a lot of point if they're in the middle of a, you know, existential conflict. You know damn well they're not going to spend the money on, like, you know, better infrastructure and whatever else. It's invariably going to be money spent on the war effort so that the government can preserve itself. Mm-hmm. But in this case, the IMF went ahead anyway. And that kind of illustrates the degree of, you know, that illustrates the influence of politics on decision making in the IMF and the World Bank, which, you know, usually they're decent at that. You know, there's not a whole lot of intrusion into the IMF's affairs from the United States, but occasionally they do dip in if they think there's an important issue at stake. To kind of give you the background on this, you know, there was a lot of debate between the United States and Europe during the Bretton Woods Conference about who would control the money that was controlled by the World Bank and the IMF, you know. And, you know, the Europeans were not interested in just letting the United States have all of the power. They wanted to have a seat at the table, too. So the compromise that was reached is that Europeans would basically run and fund the World Bank. Well, I think the United States helps fund it too, but the Europeans would run the World Bank anyway. You know, the board of directors is predominantly appointed by European states, and the IMF in turn would be controlled by the United States. So again, occasionally, you know, Europe might dip into some of the decision making of the World Bank to sway a decision in a way that's more politically favorable. But generally, you know, on the whole, they keep it relatively professional. But just like Europe would do that, you know, to dip in there like that, the United States will do that with the IMF. But you very rarely hear about, say, the United States trying to influence the World Bank or European nations trying to influence the IMF. You know, they will try to at times, but for the most part, both the United States and European states respect each other's sphere of influence, institutional sphere of influence in terms of their control over the two institutions. So in the case of the IMF giving $16 billion to Ukraine, you know, maybe they did that on their own, but I pretty strongly suspect the US government kind of weighed in and used its leverage on the IMF's board of directors to try to sway that decision towards giving money.
Dagnip says the IMF's main purpose is to make Argentina miserable.
Yeah, Argentines pretty much hate the IMF more than anything. I've gathered that much. Even before I corresponded with Dagnip, I was pretty aware of that. Dagnip pretty well just confirmed it for me. I don't blame them. I think there's other problems, structural problems in Argentina's economy that are probably just as much to blame, if not more so. But yeah, I don't begrudge them hating the IMF. I totally understand where they're coming from. Let's see, what else did we have here? China says that they will not sell weapons to either side in the war in Ukraine. So said their foreign minister. So, take it for what it's worth. Talk is cheap, as the old saying goes. But the fact that they did come out and say it openly and confidently suggests that it could be true. They didn't have to come out and say they wouldn't. They could have just said, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't, and then just played coy, and that would have been fine for them. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they just came out and said it openly suggests that they're at least thinking about it. We've talked about it before, but I'll reiterate the point again. China and Russia are not allies, not in any formal sense. They do cooperate with each other on projects of common interest, but they don't have any kind of like blood pact, to go to bat for each other when the chips are down. They'll help each other if it's convenient, mm-hmm. but they have no legal or treaty obligation to really help each other to the maximum extent possible for one side or the other. It's all about convenience for authoritarian states.
Yeah, so it's not like a NATO CSTO kind of thing where if one is attacked, they'll defend each other kind of a thing?
Exactly. Yeah, there is no treaty. There is no defense treaty between China and Russia that requires them to do that. Mm-hmm.
Did we talk about Finland joining? I think we knew that was going to happen. I think Sweden and Finland originally were planning to join together, but Erdogan was being a stick in the mud about Sweden.
Yeah, he's still pissy about the PKK. He wants Sweden to take a harder line on the PKK, to not give either current or former members of the PKK asylum, and he wants them to extradite certain former members of the PKK who had taken refuge in Sweden. So the Swedes had not responded to those entreaties to the satisfaction of Turkey's government. And as a result, they had been, as you say, stonewalling on Sweden's accession to NATO. Mm-hmm. But Finland didn't have those problems. Finland didn't really have any PKK members, either former or current, in their country seeking refuge. So it wasn't nearly as much of a problem for them. They had wanted to join with Sweden, again, as you say, but eventually they kind of talked to the Swedish government, and they decided that it would be best if Finland just went forward without Sweden, which surprised me. The last time we talked about this, I said that I didn't expect Finland to go forward without Sweden because they generally cooperate pretty closely on strategic matters. But apparently I was wrong. Not an unusual occurrence, unfortunately. But yeah, I missed the mark again. So in this case, yeah, they did reach an agreement. Finland has been allowed to move forward, and I think they're supposed to join NATO officially pretty soon, because I think they have all of the verification that they need. Not verification, ratification. I think all of the countries necessary have ratified their accession at this point, with maybe the exception of Hungary. But yeah, Turkey is still hung up on Sweden. Mm-hmm. They have said that they'll probably pass it after the elections in Turkey that are upcoming. Who knows what they'll do? Erdogan may have something he wants again, or who knows. But it's not out of the question that they may actually follow through with that promise, because the main concern for Erdogan right now is that he doesn't want to alienate nationalist voters in Turkey. I think we talked about it last time too. Turkey's politics range from the nationalist to the ultra-nationalist. Yeah. That's your spectrum. So if you're pissing off nationalist voters, you're really hurting your chances of winning an election in Turkey. And Turkish nationalists hate a lot of things and people, but probably near the top of the list are the PKK and Kurdish nationalists. So given that Sweden has harbored some, so it could be said, it's no surprise that Erdogan is being very careful and being, a hard ass, so to speak, in his dealings with Sweden regarding accession to NATO. So once he's won re-election, or if he wins re-election, he probably won't care so much. Once he's gotten what he wants, it won't be as big a deal, and he'll probably be willing to give way, probably very quietly. It probably won't be in Turkey's media very much, I would expect.
And then for people who aren't aware of the acronym, what is the PKK again?
If you talk to different people, you'll get different answers. But the short version is that it's a separatist militia of Kurds, that is to say, ethnic Kurdish people in Turkey who are fighting for an independent Kurdistan, that is to say, an independent homeland for Kurds. The southeastern portion of Turkey is predominantly ethnic Kurdish, rather, and there is no Kurdish state anywhere on the planet. The Kurds are, I think they are still the largest ethnic group on the planet that has no country of their own. And so Kurdish nationalism has been a pretty strong factor in Middle Eastern politics for more than 100 years or so now. Ever since Kurdish nationalism became a thing and started to gain currency amongst ethnic Kurds in the region. It's kind of been a running thorn in the side of various governments in the region which don't want to give up any land to make an independent Kurdistan. Understandably so. States don't want to give up land, so no shock that they're being stubborn about it. But Turkish nationalists in particular really don't like them because from their perspective, they're Turks. They even created a fake name for them. They started calling them Mountain Turks in the 1970s.
I think I remember you telling me that, yeah.
Yeah. That was part of their effort to try to assimilate them into ethnic Turks. So that didn't work too well. Some success, but for the most part, the Kurds have managed to maintain their own independent ethnic identity within Turkey. And unfortunately, that's resulted in a considerable amount of violence in Turkey, especially starting in the 1980s. There had been some militant Kurdish nationalism in Turkey even before the 1980s, but it really took off in the early 1980s with the formation of the PKK, which was it was a radical Marxist revolutionary group that wanted to seize control of southeastern Turkey and carve it into an independent Kurdish homeland. It's kind of a weird group. I mean, I think most people just know the PKK as radical separatists, but actually they do have this weirdly hierarchical top-down organization in which their leader, whom I believe is a guy named Öcalan, their leader is like they've built a cult around him. He's sort of the dear leader, of the group. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the group is Marxist in ideology, so it's also radical leftist in nature. So it almost has a Stalinist structure to it, in so much as they have like a paramount leader who's almost deified and whose control over the group is absolute.
Interesting.
But more to the point, they've engaged in a lot of terrorism, which is what I'm sure most Turkish nationalists would characterize them as terrorists, and that's it. Mm-hmm. For them, it's just a terrorist group in Turkey. Yeah. And, they have done a lot of terror. There has been suicide bombings and other bombings that have killed civilians and explicitly targeted civilians at that. So, I'm not disputing that they've engaged in terrorism. But they are more than just a terrorist group as well. They are separatists and nationalists in addition to being terrorists. So 1980s is when they really got their start. And then after that, for like 10, 15 years, there was a campaign of terrorism and violence against both the Turkish military and the Turkish civilians. And eventually, the leader of the PKK was arrested and put in prison in the 90s. He's actually stayed in prison ever since. But the group kept fighting, and eventually a negotiated settlement was reached, and the fighting significantly died down. And there was a period of maybe like 15, 20 years where things were relatively quiet in Turkey, and where the Kurds were not really able to get like full equality and get everything they wanted, but they were treated somewhat better. There was a kind of détente between Turkish nationalists and Kurdish nationalists. And then Erdogan came along, and it's kind of, people kind of forget this now these days, but he was actually originally, very unusually anyway, pro-Kurdish. When his AKP party started, really winning and getting control of the government, he was known for trying to reach out to the Kurdish population of Turkey and to try to incorporate them into his sort of network of power, basically. They were made into one of his key constituencies, but also they were part of the patronage network. So that worked for a while and helped maintain the peace, but eventually a problem arose, which is that Erdogan wanted to shift gears, right? He wanted to get he wanted to cross a threshold of seats in the legislature with his party, that is, so that he could change the constitution. I think he wanted to make it a presidential system, if I'm not mistaken. Before, he had been like prime minister, basically. Mm-hmm. There had been a president before, but it was like a symbolic president. You know, some countries have presidents that basically just fulfill a symbolic role and have relatively minimal power. You know, basically they're just meant to serve as an additional check and balance on the power of other, leaders in the government, but otherwise they don't have any power beyond that. So he wanted to shift the whole political system over to a more presidential system, but he didn't have the votes to do it, and so there was an election. He hoped to cross that threshold necessary to change the constitution with only his party, or at least his party in conjunction with the support of allied parties, but he failed to do so. And a big part of the problem was that there was a Kurdish political party called, I think it was called the HDP, something like that. But it was a reform party. Their big thing was trying to reform the country and whatnot. And it was very popular amongst Kurdish people in particular, because one of the reforms they wanted to make was to give more language rights and educational rights to Kurdish people in Turkey. There's lots of restrictions about the degree to which children can be educated in their own language in Turkey. So Kurds obviously kind of want to change that so that they can kind of pass their language on to their children and whatnot. So the HDP was very popular with Kurds, and they were also opposed to the constitutional changes being proposed by Erdogan and the AKP. So given that they were the principal obstacle that Erdogan was facing here in his desire to change the political system, that really explains what happened next, which is that Erdogan turned on the HDP, and the Kurdish population in general. So what he did is he dumped the Kurds as allies in his political coalition, and instead he embraced the military and especially nationalists. He had pretty much been at odds with nationalists before that. Before that, his key constituents were Kurds, the business community, and Islamists. But after this election, he dumped the Kurds and embraced some of the nationalists, not all of them, but certain nationalists in the I think the MHP in particular, which is like the ultra-nationalist party in Turkey. So part of that quid pro quo, in exchange for the support of the military and the ultra-nationalists, he basically just gave up on the Kurds and let the military kind of go nuts. Mm-hmm. Now, part of that had to do with bombings. There were some, terrorist bombings in Turkey not long after he, failed in that election. And that rekindled the war against the Kurds, or rather, I should say, the war between the Kurds and the Turkish military. And there was a significant escalation of violence after that has continued right up to the present day. Now, you could blame the Kurds for that. The Turkish nationalists do. They say that the PKK started up a campaign of terrorism and that they retaliated in kind. But the timing for me was always just way too convenient, for Erdogan. Because what happened is that because that war was rekindled, the HDP lost a lot of support, especially amongst ethnic Turks. And conveniently enough, Erdogan organized another election. He called another election like a year or two after the election in which he failed to get the majority he needed. And by then, the HDP had lost so much support that the AKP was able to win enough seats to change the constitution without any help, which was the original objective in the first place. So yes, it could just be a cosmic accident, and maybe the PKK just happened to hand him the majority he needed on a platter by engaging in terrorism again. But my strong suspicion is that Erdogan and the AKP had something to do with that, because there was already some links between the AKP, the Turkish government, and radical jihadis operating in Syria. So it's entirely possible that some of those jihadis were encouraged or perhaps allowed or maybe even paid to engage in some false flag terrorist attacks that could be blamed on the PKK and the Kurdish separatists. I would add here, I can't prove that. Nobody can. Probably nobody ever will be able to. But the timing was perfect. Like right after the election, right after the first election in which he failed to get the majority he wanted, suddenly there's some terrorist attacks. Suddenly the Kurds are fighting with the government again. And suddenly Erdogan has dumped the Kurds politically, embraced the Turkish nationalists, and then calls another election and then gets the majority he needs. Like it just played out way too perfectly for me not to be suspicious about that.
Yeah, a little bit sus there.
Yeah, that's the thing. But that's where that's sort of the history of the PKK. So there was a peaceful period, but now they're fighting again, and they've been going relatively hard since then. Yeah, they don't fight conventionally. It's more like hit and run attacks, terrorist attacks, what have you. But they are very active. I think for the past year or two, I think since the pandemic, they haven't been as active. They've kind of their activity has become somewhat more subdued. There was definitely a period from 2016 roughly to 2020 in which they were pretty regularly, hitting the Turkish army in this, that, or the other province. I would add that technically Öcalan is still nominally in control of the PKK, even though he's in prison. When the government wants to negotiate, they actually still negotiate with him.
He's the figurehead guy you're talking about?
Oh, he's not a figurehead. He really is like the
absolute leader.
Yeah. Oh. Like Stalin-style cult of personality. Oh. That's his role within the PKK.
Must be pretty charismatic then, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have to be. If people are pissed off enough about a given government, you don't have to be too charismatic to convince them to go and kill people for you, just so long as it's in the name of the cause, whatever that might be. But maybe he is. You'd have to ask somebody from the region. If we have anybody from Turkey listening, let us know whether or not Öcalan is a charismatic figure in the Kurdish community in Turkey.
We actually do have someone in chat right now who used to live in Turkey, and they've been weighing in, so you can read that after.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your contribution, sir.
Yeah, reminder as a disclaimer, because we have pretty high viewership today, and some people are confused, thinking that we are speaking about absolute truths and we know everything. We don't. It's a conversation, so if you know better than we do, please help us out. Give us your take. If you're from a region, feel free to weigh in your opinion. We're just trying to make sense of what's going on. And as we've stated many times, every news source has a bias, and that includes us. So we're just trying to piece together what's going on in the world. And both Agent Smith and myself speak only English, at least fluently anyway, which does kind of narrow down the range of what types of media you can potentially consume. So that's going to have a bit of a bias as well.
Yeah. As per the usual disclaimer, I'm not speaking from a position of expertise on most of these topics. Ask me about economics. I can talk more confidently about that. Mm. As far as stuff like international events and foreign policy, that's just something I've followed regularly since I was in middle school. So I tend to have stronger background there, but not necessarily academic training per se. Although I did take some courses in grad school, which I probably should not have taken in retrospect.
Why not?
I would have probably been... Not definitely. I shouldn't. Yeah, it would have been better if I had taken like a panel data class and also a time series class. Panel data is like combination time series and cross-sectional data. So it's data regarding different variables, and then also those variables are measured across time. So you can combine all of that into a single data set, and panel data analysis is just regression analysis that it analyzes that data. So a panel data class is a class in which you are taught the statistical methodologies that are used to study a data set like that. And that's like the sine qua non of a lot of academic research. Like panel data is super common. And because I'm a little dumb, I didn't take a panel data class. I took some other stuff instead. So yeah, that's one of the regrets I have. I kept telling myself, I'm going to specialize in qualitative analysis, so I don't really need all that statistic stuff.
Yeah.
Dumb. Don't be like me. Take the fucking panel data class. Even if you don't think you need it, it's a super useful skill set to have in your toolkit. So,
I don't think you can blame yourself though, because that sounds like idealism of you think you know how things are going to go and you're optimistic about it. I feel like basically everyone in that college age range is like that. So that's about par for the course, in my opinion.
well, thank you for your generous assessment.
I don't think you're dumb.
Well, I appreciate
We
that.
all do stupid shit in our 20s. That's a requirement.
Nonetheless, anybody listening in grad school or thinking about grad school, I would strongly encourage them to look at taking a panel data class. That the skills you will learn will be very useful.
Today's stream is sponsored by Big Panel Data.
Well, if you have the opportunity, take a time series class. So, time series data is more narrow than panel data because it's not cross-sectional. You're just looking at data for a single variable across time. And that requires its own methodologies, separate from, say, cross-sectional data or panel data. But it's still very useful. Pretty much any given profession that deals with data is dealing with data over time. So taking a time series class is very useful, if only for that reason. So yeah, I probably should have taken classes on time series and panel data instead of, say, a regional class on Southeast Asia. Actually, it was South Asia and Southeast Asia. It was a regional studies class on those two regions. And then I also took a class on national security, which ended up having a focus on Latin America because the professor was a specialist in Latin America. So those classes were very cool, very interesting, very informative, but not as useful from a professional standpoint as somebody who ended up dropping out and not getting into academia. In that sense, if you are going to drop out, or if you think you might drop out, having a strong background in statistics and analytical methodologies of one kind or another, that stuff translates way better to the private sector than qualitative analytical type stuff like regional studies or whatever. Goldman Sachs wants to hire people that know how to handle numbers. They're not necessarily interested in somebody who is familiar with the political economy of, Karnataka province in India. It's not as useful for them. Very interesting to me. If you want to talk to me about it, let me know. But otherwise, yeah, you're not making a lot of money off that. Let's see. We went off on a tangent there. Where PKK? Yeah, that's what the PKK is. It's separatist organization, militia that engages in terrorism and is very, very controversial in Turkey. Yeah, Turkish nationalists in particular have very strong opinions on it, and even Turkish liberals, people who want to see a less authoritarian Turkey and who want a more moderate government and more moderate politics, even they do not like the PKK. They recognize that the Kurdish population in Turkey has kind of been oppressed to varying degrees over time, and they recognize that the government should be nicer to them, to put it simply. But at the same time, they cannot condone the terrorism. And the fact that the PKK has a totalitarian Marxist ideology that features prominently a cult of personality around their leader is also very off-putting if you are somebody who believes in liberal democracy. So for that reason, even people who might otherwise be sympathetic to the Kurdish people and some of their plight, even those people do not like the PKK.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people in the U.S. kind of speak positively about the Kurds because they're freedom fighters, and that's one of the things that we get fired up about. But the Marxist ideology is going to be a pretty big minus because I think we've been spooked about communism ever since the Cold War.
Yeah, it's not great. People tend to have a knee-jerk reaction in that sense. But I would add that in the PKK's case, it is actually somewhat justified. Let's see. Well, what else did we have here? Well, as far as going back to Ukraine here to try to finish out the notes, Russia did make a change to their draft policy, so they have shifted it so that before what they were doing is that if somebody were drafted, they would have to be served physically with a card, and the person they were drafting would have to sign the card. So now they've changed it so they just need to send an email. They don't actually have to physically serve you with the paperwork saying that you've been drafted. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of men were actually kind of abusing the loophole there. You know, the obvious loophole, which is that if they can't find you, they can't serve you with the draft papers. I remember there was one guy, this dead serious, I read this in a BBC article. There was one guy who was sufficiently worried about being drafted that he built a shack out in the woods and just lived and worked there.
Huh.
And, you know, nobody knew where he was most of the time, including his wife. He had like one shack that had that was set up to have good access to the internet, because that's how he did his work. He worked online. And then he had a separate shack away from that where he actually lived. You know, the reason he did it like that is because he was worried that maybe the authorities could track the signal, you know, kind of track the router or whatever and figure out where he was working from. So he had a work shack and then a home shack that was better hidden away from that shack. And he's apparently been living like that for a long time now, basically since pretty early in the conflict. So that's probably an extreme example. I mean, it's probably more normal for people who worry about being drafted to just leave the country. That's probably been the more common approach. But regardless, the idea is that if they can't find you or get to you, then you can't be served the papers and you can't be drafted. So now that loophole is gone. Now all they need to do is send you an email on this sort of official service that they have. It's not they're not actually emailing you. In Russia, they have this system wherein they can, wherein you as a Russian citizen can engage certain public services, like whatever driver's license renewal or what have you. And that service involves an email account that every citizen has, and the government can contact you through that account if they need to reach you. And so what the government is doing then is they're emailing the draft notices through that service, through that system. And once they've emailed you, the fact that they've emailed you serves as notice. Like, they don't actually have to verify that you've received the email or whatever. Once they send the email, then you have, I think, 20 days. That's what it is. You have 20 days to report in and join the army. Or I guess one of the others, probably the army, though. But yeah, 20 days. And after that, you could be in trouble. So obviously that was upsetting to a lot of people in Russia. They were enjoying the loophole. And now that's not there. So that's going to open up a new can of worms. But even beyond that, the bigger problem is the signal it sends. The fact that they made that change suggests that the government is at least thinking about another wave of mobilizations, which suggests that well, for one, it suggests the conflict's nowhere near being done, but also it suggests that a lot more people are going to be drummed into the army soon. And that's going to be very off-putting to people, not only people who are critical of the war, just in general, but more to the point, a broader part of the population that does not want to die in the war, regardless of whether they support it or not, which is a pretty large chunk of the body politic over there. So if the government does mobilize a lot of people in the future, that's really going to put stress on the political system. I don't think there's ever going to be enough stress from the war to really seriously endanger the regime there, the Putin government. But there is going to be more pressure, and in turn, you're going to see more fallout from that pressure, probably in the form of more people leaving the country or otherwise trying to evade the draft board in Russia. And that could lead to some drama you'll be reading about. But for now, they've just made the change without doing another mobilization. So all of that is, speculation on my part for the moment. Let's see. So we had some more Pentagon leak stuff.
Got another leak?
Not another leak, but, there was a lot of stuff leaked.
Oh.
And, journalists are still kind of moving through all of it. It's worth mentioning, too, that most, if not all, of the material that was leaked has been removed from the relevant Discord channel. So it may be that we're never able to fully know exactly everything that was leaked.
Mm-hmm.
But journalists, in so much as they've been able to acquire the documents that were leaked, they're still going through them. And so some of the more recent stuff that I was reading about, apparently the Serbian government has committed to sending lethal aid to Ukraine, which is surprising because Serbia is not known for being pro-Ukrainian. They're known for being pro-Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very controversial, both inside and outside of Serbia. Yeah, the Serbian government is really getting squeezed right now because on the one hand, pro-Russian sentiment is very common, but at the same time, there's a lot of sentiment in favor of integrating with the West because a lot of people see that as being the better choice economically. They think doing so will offer more economic opportunities and more potential for advancement for Serbia in terms of economic development. So there's a lot of tension there, and the Serbian government is kind of trying to balance the two forces within the context of Serbian politics. So not sending aid to Ukraine is what I would expect, given Serbian nationalism and pro-Russian sentiment. And if this is true, that they have promised to send lethal aid, then those people will be aggravated, almost certainly. So we'll see if there's any fallout from that. I think the Serbian government has denied it and has said that it's just a false flag operation to make them look bad, but that's probably what the kids would call a cope. I don't think that's accurate. Still, I think the bigger question is why they would want to send arms in the first place. I mean, it would be very easy for them to just do nothing. So I'm pretty curious why they would bother at all.
It's really funny whenever you have like these high level political scenarios that are described with Zoomerisms. Like one of the other ones that was talked about by us, it was maybe like a few months ago, but there was something that went wrong for someone and people on Reddit were saying that it was a skill issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I try to keep it relatively professional, but if the right word is there, you kind of go for it.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens with Syria. Also, one of the leaks not suggests, but says that there are 100 Western Special Forces personnel in Ukraine. And some people on Reddit were pretending like that was a big deal, but honestly, that's not even remotely surprising to me. And really, I think most people, I don't think it's unusual for the United States or other European governments to send Special Forces personnel into allied states in order to assist them. I think the implication a lot of people took from that is that these Special Forces personnel were engaging in active operations against the Russian army in combat. But, that's possible. If that's true, it would be a lot more interesting. But my assumption, and what I think is the more likely scenario, is that they're just doing train and assist. Basically, they're offering training to Ukrainian personnel. They're performing an advisory role. It could be a more direct advisory role. Advisory can be pretty fudgy when you want it to be. That happened a lot in Vietnam. When the United States had not sent actual infantry into Vietnam yet, one of the things they did is they would send advisors they would embed, rather, Special Forces advisors into Vietnamese units. I think more at like the battalion level, sort of a higher level than just like regular troops, but they were present. And what would happen is that the Vietnamese officers they were working with were generally just too inexperienced to really know what to do, or they would make a lot of mistakes. So what would happen is that they would offer quote unquote suggestions that in effect, de facto were always followed to the point where they were effectively in command of the unit. So that's kind of crossing a line. It's kind of a broad, blurry line, but that could be what some of the Special Forces personnel are doing in Ukraine right now. Possibly, but again, that's speculation. I don't know. Probably more likely it's something a lot more boring. Let's see. There was some talk about Ukraine's upcoming counteroffensive. So there's been, a lot of talk about that. So the leaks suggest a couple interesting items. One, they say that the Ukrainians are planning to push east and south, and particularly, more specifically, in the case of the push to the south, they're looking to sever the land bridge between eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So again, that's not even remotely a surprise. That's kind of what everybody assumed would happen. I mean, so that's not really like a big compromise. That's not like an example of a really bad compromising of Ukrainian operational security. That's pretty much what everybody was expecting anyway. But in so much as that's accurate, you can kind of consider that confirmation, if you like. More interestingly, there was a leak from of a U.S. intelligence assessment. And so apparently, if, again, all of this is like assuming that this is not just bullshit, assuming the guy that leaked it didn't modify it in some way or wasn't making shit up. But if the leak is accurate, then it seems that U.S. intelligence agencies do not believe that any kind of Ukrainian offensive that might be upcoming this spring or summer is going to make anything more than just marginal gains. And also not surprising, I've actually talked about that here, how the Ukrainian military probably won't make like big sweeping gains soon. Or more accurately, I was relaying information I heard from an interview of an analyst who had been talking about it. But this would seem to confirm that viewpoint. So it seems pretty unlikely then. Between Michael Kaufman talking about it and the leak, it seems almost assured that the Ukrainian army is not going to take back a whole lot of territory very quickly over the course of the next couple months. Let's see. Russian units in eastern Ukraine are particularly shabby, supposedly. So one of the documents talked about that. Apparently, they're having a lot of trouble, quote, camouflaging sensitive sites. Substandard care in camouflaging sensitive sites and reckless ammunition storage. So that doesn't really surprise anybody who's been following the conflict. Everybody kind of knows Russian logistics are pretty shit overall. They've improved a little bit over time, but overall, professionalism seems to be lacking. So not necessarily surprising. I think the more interesting thing here is that the lack of professionalism seems to be particularly concentrated in the east. So not so much in the south or maybe necessarily in front of, say, Donetsk or Bakhmut, but other areas of the south seem to be particularly poor in that regard. And that could suggest that the overall quality of the Russian army is lower than maybe we thought. It could be that in so much as there's been successful efforts by Russia to push into, say, Bakhmut or to successfully defend other territories, it could be that those efforts reflect concentration of some of the best Russian units and that they don't really have enough good units overall to have, a fully professionally manned front line all across the front. The Ukrainians are almost certainly in a very similar position in that regard. That's not going to be a uniquely Russian thing. But this, again, would seem to confirm that. I think one of the most interesting things that was in the leak is Ukraine's air defenses could be set to effectively run out of ammunition starting in, last month. Next month. Sorry, it's next month, May 23rd. So apparently they've been blowing through inventories, not so much shooting down Russian aircraft per se, but more so Russian cruise missiles. Cruise missiles and drones, smart munitions of one sort or another. That apparently has been of sufficient scale to significantly deplete their inventory to the point where they may not be able to keep up the pace for much longer. So roughly by starting April or May, they're going to have to significantly curtail usage of surface-to-air missile systems of all varieties in order to prioritize probably what will be cruise missiles, I would guess. Right now, they're just trying to shoot down like everything they can, especially when the Russians just lob like big volleys of cruise missiles, like they did when they were attacking the electrical grid. But going forward, again, if this is accurate, then going forward, they're going to have to economize SAM systems and their ammunition such that they focus on probably cruise missiles, maybe drones. I guess you could make a case either way. Regardless, they're not going to be shooting down nearly as much stuff they're going to have to pick and choose much more to a degree that they're not doing right now. And so the implications there is that it could be much easier for the Russian army to do things like airstrikes, drone surveillance, and possibly also penetration strikes by cruise missiles, if not also aircraft. So overall, the Russians will have relatively more air superiority than they had before, with corresponding implications for air support for Russian ground troops, which thus far they have not really enjoyed much of. Whether or not the West somehow boosts support to Ukraine in some way, or if the Ukrainians are able to find some kind of innovative way around that problem such that there's not a severe detrimental impact on the front line, that remains to be seen. That's kind of the big question. But again, we're not going to see the fallout until probably April or May, probably more so May, given the numbers that I was saying. They were saying they were going to, they're going to run out of SA-11 systems by April 13th. Sorry, missiles. They're going to run out of SA-11 missiles by April 13th. They're projected to run out of NASAMS munitions by April 15th. And they were saying they're going to run out of SA-8 munitions by May. So, those are all different SAM systems. And May seems to be more what they're, well, I guess April in those cases, but April, May, again, let's say. So we'll see what happens around that time. But for now, they're still holding on.
Are those some of the types of munitions that the West has been donating?
No. Okay. I mean, NASAMS, yes. We've been giving them NASAMS. But most of their SAM systems are actually Russian. They're legacy systems from the Cold War, basically, from the Red Army. And also any systems that they bought in like the 90s and early aughts. Well, aughts in general, before the whole Crimean business basically cut Ukraine off from the Russian defense industrial complex. One of the reasons they're running low on ammunition is just the fact that they can't buy new missiles from Russia. Mm-hmm. Again, most of their inventory is just Russian systems. Even now, after they've gotten all the stuff that they've gotten from the West, Russian systems still predominate. But without access to Russian industry, they can't get new parts, new ammunition, etc. So over time, they're going to have to transition to probably Western sources of vehicles and munitions. But at the moment, they're kind of in between, Russian and Western systems, awkwardly so. Yeah, they can produce some of their own munitions, but not nearly enough to make up for, how many they're using. Like, usage is very heavy, to put it mildly. And so Ukrainian industry just can't keep up with that demand. And to kind of highlight that point and to underline the implications, the leak kind of emphasized that Russia is also feeling logistical problems, right? They're kind of having issues with supply as well. The issue is that Ukraine just has it worse, right? So the Russians have to economize their munitions and struggle to keep everybody supplied with all of the weapons and ammo that they need. But in Ukraine's case, they approach like dangerously low levels of inventory regularly, right? So they're constantly getting close to scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they keep having to economize more and more because they're not getting sufficient supplies in order to allow them to use as much as they would like to in combat. So they can prevent themselves from running out, by kind of rationing their supply. They can avoid just completely running out, but that has implications for the battlefield because they can't use the weapons at every opportunity that might present itself because they have to ration.
What happened to the individual who leaked all this stuff? Like, that's got to be a turbo felony, right?
I like that. Turbo felony. They ought to put that on the books.
Well, there are felonies that are a danger to your local community, and then there's like national security fumbles that are just like super bad.
Yeah, he's in a lot of trouble. They've already found him and arrested him, and he's having all of the things thrown at him in court. So yeah, he's going to jail for a while.
They threw shit at him in court? Well, okay.
They threw the book at him, let's say.
They threw a book at him. That's what you get.
For our non-native English speakers listening, To throw the book at someone is a phrase that's used in English to refer to when a prosecutor tries to get somebody penalized for all of the possible crimes that they might have committed. That might sound counterintuitive. You might think that a prosecutor will invariably, of course, try to convict somebody for all of the crimes they've committed, but that's not actually always the case. Sometimes they'll try to make a plea deal in which a given guy will give them information that's useful in another case in exchange for a lighter sentence, or maybe even just avoiding prosecution altogether. And in other times, maybe a given district attorney doesn't, well, a given prosecutor maybe doesn't think it's worth it to try to press all charges because maybe he doesn't think he has as strong a case on some of the charges. And so maybe thinks it's better just to focus on the one charge that he has the most evidence for. So to throw the book at somebody is when they just say, fuck it, we're just accusing you and going to try to convict you for all of the things that you did wrong, regardless of any kind of potential plea deal that you might agree to or anything else. Generally, this is what they do when you've really pissed somebody off. Yeah, generally, you don't see somebody like get convicted like that unless they've just grievously pissed off or aggravated a particular segment of the population, and a given prosecutor wants to make an example out of you. And that, of course, is what happened here. Obviously, this guy pissed off like one of the most powerful elements in American society, the national security state. So, yeah, they're in the process of making a thoroughgoing example of this gentleman.
Chad is saying that they read chat logs of this individual and they seem to be very pro-Russian.
Oh, I hadn't heard that, but wouldn't surprise me. From what I'd been reading, he seemed more apolitical than anything. But it makes sense that he would be, given all the information he leaked. Mm. Did you hear the details about the nature of how he leaked the information?
Yes, from a hecking TikTok personality who was just so pissed off at how, I don't know, unprofessional it was. Like, it was an IT guy who's like 21 years old. So when you're 21, I was 21 once, you don't really know the full size of the world at that point. And you don't know a lot of the big picture ramifications of what can and can't be done. And you're also very idealistic and you're very high testosterone and risk seeking. So apparently it was a Minecraft server, and it was a very petty kind of middle school level exchange of you're a hecking loser, beta, whatever the normal insults that people would throw out would be. I bet you don't do anything of value, whatever. And they're like, yeah, but I have this security clearance. And they're like, no, you don't. And then it's one of those like, I'm just going to prove it to them. So I show them how cool I am. And sure showed them how unwise you can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently it was a pretty salty server, like racist memes and stuff like that. Bunch of high testosterone Minecraft players who don't go outside much.
Yeah, the whole thing was pretty ridiculous. But somebody's going to have to write that into a history book at some point. Condolences to the author. Let's see. Well, Vladimir Putin met with Xi Jinping. We don't really know what they talked about. What?
I saw that, but they both have opaque political systems, and they don't want to tell the press what they talked about.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not going to know what they agreed to or if they agreed to anything for probably several months, and maybe not even after that. But if something does happen of a dramatic nature involving Russia and China together, pretty decent chance it'll be related to that meeting. So, kind of put a bookmark there on that one. That could be referenced later.
Mm-hmm. Chad is memeing on this guy saying that they're going to make him touch grass as punishment and put grass in his prison cell. Jeez. It's okay, we can make fun of gamers because we are gamers.
Chad on point as usual.
I'm a hermit too, so I know how it is. People ask you to go outside and you realize how expensive it is outside.
Yeah, it's steep.
Yep.
Well, the last thing here, and this is another item from the leak itself, what had to do with casualties. And these are just estimates from ostensibly from American intelligence agencies. So they're thinking that Ukrainian casualties are about 120,000, and Russian casualties are estimated at about 230,000. So that seems pretty accurate, given some of the other numbers that have kind of been passed around. Wouldn't surprise me. I'm a little surprised that the Russian casualties are so much higher, but given some of the stupid shit they've been doing for the past 6 months, it actually probably makes sense. So that gives us, what, 350,000 casualties total, not including civilians, which will probably bump the numbers up quite a bit. So if the conflict continues at this pace, we're going to hit probably 500,000 before too long, maybe within the next year or two. If it goes for 10 years, it's definitely going to break 1 million at this pace.
And to clarify, a casualty isn't necessarily a death, it's someone who has been hurt.
Yeah, correct. Casualties refers to fatalities and injuries. Well, that's pretty much all I had for Ukraine. Overall, most of the maneuvering is being done sort of behind the scenes right now. It's not to say there hasn't been fighting, on the front line. There has been, but the lines haven't been moving much. And most likely the ultimate outcome is still going to be decided by sort of broader strategic factors that are going to tie in more to things like production and politics. That's kind of true for most any industrial war, I grant that, but Ukraine in particular, even more so. Given that I guess what I'm really saying is that it's probably not going to be solved on the battlefield. Hypothetically, a conflict, all conflicts are solved by logistics, but it's possible that they could also be solved by combat, a key battle being won, etc., the collapse of an army. So even if you have shit logistics, if you can cause the other guy's army to just implode, via defeat on the battlefield, maybe you could still win the war. But that doesn't seem to be happening here, at least not yet. So it seems likely that some of the less sexy factors that play into warfare, like logistics, politics, etc., are going to be particularly important here relative to combat.
Tonight on Agent Smith, he declares the war is decided by macro, not micro. Take notes.
There you go.
Someone in the chat is going on about U.S. troops being a part of that leak, being in Ukraine. You mentioned the international
special forces.
The special force.
Yeah, I think like 30 of them are supposed to be Americans.
Okay, that seems pretty small scale, but I guess some people could freak out about that.
Yeah, well, the fact that they're there at all, I think, upsets some people, especially if they're anti-war or pro-Russia or both. The Biden administration has been saying that, they're not really they're not directly involved and that they're trying to avoid being directly involved. So the fact that there are American special forces there would seem to kind of contradict that. But given that they're probably just doing advise and assist, I don't think it's that contradictory. If they were doing like actual kinetic combat operations, like attacking the Russian units or Russian logistics supply chains, what have you, you could have a stronger case in that case that the U.S. is getting directly involved. But even then, that's so minor. Like, what are you going to do with 50 special forces operatives in a war as big as the war in Ukraine right now? It's going to be pretty limited, I would imagine. So probably U.S. involvement would have to be, if the U.S. is directly involved in that way, it would probably have to be significantly more involved to really get a big reaction out of the Russians. So either way, I don't think it really matters that much. But more likely, they're just doing something just really mundane and boring, like train and assist. So I wouldn't invest too much into it for the moment.
Yeah, and advise and assist would be people who have some experience in different conflicts. Like the U.S. has been involved in quite a few over the past few decades, so you have people who have that kind of firsthand. They can tell people how stuff actually is going to play out.
We doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got an hour.
So was there any other questions or stuff that we wanted to get to? Let me see. Wasn't sure if there was anything in particular that you wanted to touch on.
I was looking at the news and it was just a bunch of stupid he said, she said in the headlines. Russia slams the U.S. for this. It's like, yeah, every week. Next.
Yeah, it hasn't been too. I mean, you can't say the world is well behaved these days, but overall, it's pretty much just on trend. There's not a lot of big changes in trends over the past couple weeks to report. So overall, things are relatively stable. So I can't report on anything too dramatic in that regard. I'm trying to find the Smith thing here. Oh, there it is. I always skip past it. I don't know why. Oh, okay. So we didn't have any new questions. Okay.
Or aside from the ones that I've read out loud.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's see. I did have some other stuff here. Do you remember the? Did I talk about the AUKUS deal last time?
AUKUS? No, I don't know what that is.
That was the big submarine deal between the U.S. and Australia.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was AUKUS. AUKUS is Australia, UK, US. They really should come up with a better name for it. AUKUS just sounds kind of weird and
like you have something stuck in your throat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not great. But for now, that's what we have. So the key part of that deal that was signed between the UK, the US, and Australia had to do with submarines. And there was some question as to just what the UK was getting out of it. Because it's the way they were reporting it at the time, it sounded like Australia was just promising to buy some American submarines. And, as a side note, almost, they mentioned that there was going to be cooperation between all three countries in terms of research and development regarding key upcoming cutting edge technologies, stuff like encryption, artificial intelligence, and that kind of stuff. But they didn't really elaborate too much on what that would look like in practice. So whenever it was that I took these notes, I didn't put down the date, but basically there were new details about the AUKUS deal that were released that actually make a lot more sense. So specifically what's going to happen is that the 5 Virginia-class submarines that Australia is going to buy from the United States are going to be built with British reactors. So they're nuclear subs, so they have nuclear reactors. Normally, the Virginia class would be built with American-made nuclear reactors, but in this case, for the purposes of this deal, they're going to be built with British reactors. So that's an important detail because that actually does benefit the UK and illustrates that they do have a stake in the deal somehow. Before they didn't seem to have any interest. They didn't seem to have any incentive or stake in the deal as it was announced initially. But this makes much more sense. Also, and this is maybe more important, Australia has, as part of the deal, promised to co-develop an entirely new submarine with the United Kingdom, which is going to use some US technology. So that's going to be expensive, but that's probably the point. One of the things you want to do with military spending, besides acquiring new technologies and capabilities and whatnot, you also want to make sure that your military industry has enough money to maintain its capacity. Because unless you're just regularly buying up stuff, then those companies are not going to have enough revenue to justify keeping factory lines open, keeping skilled workers hired, etc. And when you lose when those factories close down, you do lose skill, and it can be very difficult to rebuild the necessary skills that are needed to build advanced equipment. So ensuring a relatively steady stream of revenue for manufacturers of military equipment, that is part of the calculus that goes into determining how much money goes into military procurement and what it is that you're procuring. So here you can see this is basically an effort to impart generate revenue for that purpose for the military industries of all three nations involved, Australia, the UK, and the US. But you can also see that it's an effort to integrate those industrial complexes. So instead of just having separate military industries that are solely dependent on individual governments, going forward, they're going to try to shift gears so that military industries in each country are dependent on all three governments. And that'll mean some sacrifice on the part of some industries. You can't keep everybody, but by doing it this way, you're able to spread the costs among three governments rather than just one, which helps make things a little bit cheaper. And then by extension, you're also able to maybe not attribute, but you're able to spend more money. Basically, you're able to spread money across a larger industrial base. It's the economies of scale, and then also diversion. Diversion. The phrase escapes me. Division of labor. There we go. So you're going to have a more efficient division of labor with the military industries of three countries rather than just one. So you're kind of integrating a certain degree of free trade and competition into military production that had not traditionally existed in that space. So basically, the UK in the short term is going to get a boost because they're going to be building some reactors for these subs, specifically submarine reactors. And then in the long term, they're going to get an even bigger boost in the form of the new submarine that they're going to co-develop with Australia. And presumably, they're also going to be the ones building that submarine when it's eventually when the design phase is finished. And so that'll be a big boost to British naval shipyards. And so the United States in the short term gets the benefit of selling and producing the Virginia-class submarines. And then in the long term, we'll get a little bit of a boost, a smaller boost, in the form of the undisclosed technology that is supposed to be incorporated into the new Australian-British submarine that they're going to develop. So it's a fair trade. You can see how they've kind of, traded off short-term versus long-term gains there. It's a pretty interesting deal in that sense. I still think the low-key, more important part of the deal is actually the research and development cooperation over advanced technologies. That was almost an afterthought in the initial reporting, but doing stuff like burden sharing and cost sharing in the development of artificial intelligence technologies and whatnot. I think over the very long term, that's going to end up being the main crux of this agreement. I kind of suspect the submarine stuff is more about integrating defense bases than anything, but that's nice, but that's almost like bureaucratic. It's not sexy. That's not, bureaucratic stuff regarding defense industries and defense bases. That's very rarely sexy politics, unless you're like really deep into policy. That is to say, public policy. But the technologies they're going to develop in coordination with each other, the AI stuff, that's probably going to be very interesting. Once it really matures and starts getting used. But that's probably going to be like, 20 years in the future, whenever. So some interesting new details there, I thought. Let's see. Did you see the Saudi Arabia? Well, did you see that Saudi Arabia joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
I did not see that. What does that entail?
It doesn't really entail much. Sometimes people talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a counterweight to NATO, because it's an organization that involves a degree of security cooperation between its members. And its members include, prominently, they include Russia and China, but also other states. I think India joined not too long ago. And Iran, I think, is a member as well. And I think they've also got a few observer member states of varying degrees. So the fact that Saudi Arabia joined was notable because, for those who see the SCO as like a counterweight to the West, it seems like the Saudis are aligning with China and Russia. But that's not what it was. The SCO is not a military organization. Russia and China do engage in military exercises together under the rubric of the SCO, but that's it. Like the defense cooperation pretty much ends there. They do engage in some defense cooperation involving, sharing technology and production and whatnot, but that stuff is done outside of the SCO. They do that basically on a bilateral basis. Other than, military exercises, the SCO is basically just a talking shop where everybody agrees not to fuck with each other's sovereignty. which they weren't going to do anyway. So not that useful. It's almost like a Central Asian version of the of ASEAN, right? The Southeast Asian Organization. Well, association, technically. It's ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, something like that. It was kind of originally intended to eventually become a supranational organization that could unite all of the Southeast Asian nation states together in sort of a common bloc. But in practice, it's just a talking shop. Like, the only thing they ever agree on is that they shouldn't violate each other's sovereignty, and that nobody should ever pass a amendment or a resolution that would require them to do anything, like to do anything, basically. Sovereignty is the main thing, but because sovereignty is the main objective of the organization, in practice, they can't bind states to do anything, which renders the organization effectively, moot. Like, it doesn't accomplish anything. So the SCO is very similar in that regard. It doesn't do anything of substance. So it looks exciting. If you're very skeptical of the United States, the SCO looks like it could potentially become a counterweight someday, but in practice, it does not now, and probably never will. Again, like I was saying before, Russia and China are not allies, and they're not really that interested in an alliance. Again, they're much more opportunistic rather than sort of ideologically aligned like the United States is with some of its partner nations. So that's going to be a block for them, given that their authoritarian governments just don't trust each other any more than they trust anybody else. So Saudi Arabia joining is newsworthy. It kind of shows that the Saudis are trying to open channels to China and are trying to improve diplomatic relations and connections to China, maybe to Russia to a lesser degree, but that doesn't matter as much. They were already doing that bilaterally. China's the real game there. So it's notable for that reason, but I don't think Saudi Arabia joining them means that, they're suddenly going to align with them militarily or strategically or what have you. Keep in mind that Iran is a member, too, of the SCO, and the Saudis are not on good terms with the Iranians and are not going to be for a long time, most likely. Mm-hmm. So, even that fact alone would probably prevent the Saudis from doing anything substantive in the SCO, even beyond the just general tension between the authoritarian member states. Let's see, we already talked about Sudan. We got that. Oh, yeah, there was rapprochement between Japan and South Korea.
Oh,
did you hear about that? You didn't hear about it? Okay.
No.
That had to do with there was like there was a falling out in relations back in like 2018, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with the comfort women. Do you remember that particular issue?
I think I know what that is, but I don't remember.
It's like the sex slaves and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that they had all the... Well, I mean, for those listening who maybe just aren't familiar with the topic, it has to do with the period in which Korea was colonized by Japan in the early 20th century. Japan colonized Korea like the UK colonized Ireland. In the Koreans' case, they were only colonized for about 50, 60 years, thereabouts, but the Japanese were quite thorough, in their efforts to colonize that space. So it's very much a sore point in Korean history, especially amongst Korean nationalists. So one of the things that happened during World War II is that a number of Korean women were coerced to varying degrees into serving as prostitutes for the Imperial Japanese Army. And, the Japanese government at various times has said, these women were just prostitutes and we paid them to do their job, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that just pisses everybody off because, some of them, at least some of them were not, but more likely most of them were just village girls and other women who were basically forced against their will to serve as prostitutes overseas. So Korean nationalists have made this one of their casus belli against Japan. It's been a running sore in relations for a long time. It was nominally addressed and settled in the 1970s when the Japanese government apologized and actually gave the Korean government a pretty decent sum of money, kind of as part of a settlement. But apparently a lot of that money did not end up in the hands of the actual victims involved. And so a lot of nationalists did not consider the issue truly resolved even after that. And the issue kind of waxed and waned in importance in Korean politics, just depending on, who was trying to excite whatever constituency they needed to win office. But in particular, it became explosive in 2018. What had happened is that the Korean government had leaned on Japanese companies that had history going back to the war, back to World War II, that were operating in Korea during World War II. And they demanded, and this was the result of a court ruling. It wasn't just the South Korean government like arbitrarily trying to shake them down. There was a court ruling relating to the comfort women issue. And the result is that some of these Japanese corporations operating in South Korea were required to offer a significant sum in compensation to the victims of the comfort women issue. And the Japanese government did not take that well. They immediately slapped sanctions on South Korea. Specifically, they restricted the export of key materials that are used in the production of semiconductors. I think these were basically exotic gases that were used in the production process relevant to semiconductors. And because the South Korean semiconductor industry was cut off from their primary source for these gases, the industry did take a hit for a while. I didn't think it would last that long. At the time when it happened, I expected it just to be like a symbolic thing, and then they would just make peace a couple months later. But it ended up, the trade war there ended up maintaining itself for the next 4 some years. What would it be, like 5 years now? So that really surprised me. I didn't think the Japanese government would give that much of a shit about it, but apparently they did. So, there were various efforts to try to negotiate an end to the sanctions and also a resolution to the comfort women issue, but none of those went anywhere. And it looked like it was just going to be a semi-permanent state of affairs. But more recently, the newest prime minister of South Korea, the current guy, I think his name is Yoon, if I'm not mistaken, he actually took the initiative of traveling to Japan and just saying that he was going to drop the issue. He did that unilaterally ahead of a conference. And he had sent some little signals that he might do that, which is why the Japanese government had agreed to the conference in the first place. But then during the conference, he just announced that he was going to drop it. That's not to say they're not doing anything about it. They did announce that they're going to have a plan where some of the South Korean companies that benefited from the payment that Japan made in the 1970s will themselves be required to pay money as a tax, effectively, into a fund that will be distributed to the surviving victims of the comfort women issue that occurred in World War II. So they have tried to address it, but they've tried to address it on their own. They're not pushing the Japanese government, to give them more money. So that seems to have appeased Tokyo, and Tokyo has since announced that they're going to unwind the sanctions that they had applied on South Korea. So that should be good for South Korea's semiconductor industry. They'd already found, I think, alternative suppliers, so there may not be too much of a bump in trade there. I don't know if those trade links will be reestablished. I don't know that semiconductors producers necessarily trust the Japanese at this point in order to go back to them. But I could be wrong. It could be that the Japanese producers are sufficiently efficient and cost effective that it may be too good a deal to ignore. We'll see. But for the moment, anyway, the issue is dropped and over and resolved, at least until the next big nationalist emotional outburst. But it really kind of, the way I was reading it anyway, it really speaks to the professionalism and I guess you could say courage. I don't like using courage to describe politicians mostly because a lot of what they do is very calculated and self-serving, but you have to give credit to Yoon here because he did go out on a limb, so to speak. He did put his political career at risk by risking the ire of Korean nationalists by dropping this issue with Japan and trying to focus on repairing relations. It was certainly very good diplomatically, not only from a bilateral perspective, but also a multilateral perspective. Because this sort of divide between Japan and South Korea is a running thorn in the side of Washington. Because the United States wants all of its allies in the region to be on the same page so that they can all focus on what Washington considers the main problem in the region, which of course is China. And it's much harder to do that when two of your main allies are bickering with each other like this. So Washington, I imagine, was quite pleased with this development. This really does serve to ease tensions, and ideally, from the perspective of the United States government, will facilitate much greater and better cooperation between South Korea and Japan, if not also South Korea, Japan, and the United States. So a little strategic victory there diplomatically for the United States, if not the region in general.
There was a question, kind of going back to Turkey a little bit. There were some earthquakes, and they were just wondering if there was any update on like humanitarian efforts and if they'd recovered from that.
Oh, I see. I haven't followed it. They're probably still struggling. Turkey is still a developing country, and there were some bureaucratic problems with the response. So they're probably still struggling, but I haven't read any updates on it, so I couldn't tell you. Yeah, the only follow-up that I've read since it happened had to do with the political implications, which were basically bad for Erdogan, as you can imagine. I guess we've talked about it before, but it bears repeating that Erdogan went out of his way to move up the date for the upcoming election so he could take advantage of his popularity and hedge against the possibility of a significant negative event happening, only to have a significant negative event to happen anyway. So that was a little hedging action on his part that ended up blowing up in his face, because now the election is going to happen closer to the earthquake than it would have happened if he had not moved the election up. And that's probably, well, almost certainly going to cost him a lot of votes. Some bad political luck there for Mr. Erdogan.
Have you had any update you've seen on Myanmar?
No, it's just ugly. Just really ugly. Like the government is just bombing villages they suspect of supporting the rebels, and so there's just occasionally stories I see in the news about like this, that, or the other random village being wiped out either by airstrikes or by anti-insurgent sweeps by the Myanmar military, by the Myanmar army rather. But yeah, I haven't read any updates as far as like the strategic balance between the rebels and the army. It seems like the rebels seem to be gaining some traction, and so much as they're able to increase their operational tempo and get more support amongst rural people, especially in the Salween sort of basin area where most of the population lives. But beyond that, I haven't read about any significant teetering or doubts happening regarding the ability of the current military government to stay in power, but neither have I heard anything about, I haven't heard anything that suggests the rebels are losing momentum either. So it seems like we're still in a phase, we're still sort of in a decisive phase of the conflict where it could kind of go either way, depending on who can outlast the other side. Have you been following the abortion stuff in the United States?
I saw something about a certain medicine or something that was
Mephistopron.
That sounds like an ancient god. Yeah, they were worshiping the altar of Mephistophone, and something went to the Supreme Court or whatever, and they decided to still allow the use of this kind of stuff. I didn't really.
Yeah, it was kind of dumb, but basically there was a case brought by, what was it, a pro-life group, and they were making a weird argument about the FDA. They were saying that this, I'm almost certainly mispronouncing it. That's going to bug the hell out of me. Mephistoprone, I think is what it is. Mephistoprol? I'm getting it so wrong that Google has no idea what the hell I'm talking about. There's two drugs in the United States that are used for abortions that are just very early stage. They're basically used as pills. They're abortion pills. And you can use them if you're very early in a pregnancy. Sorry, what?
It's like a Plan B kind of thing where it's like really tiny, low stage of development sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of like that. Plan B is like immediately. That's like the day after. But this stuff you can use in like the first month of pregnancy or whatever. And it's better to use them both together, from what I've heard. That's supposed to like optimize the effectiveness, but you can use one or the other, and they mostly work just as well. So one of these drugs was said by a pro-life group here in the United States to have not been properly cleared by the FDA, which is the agency of the federal government, which is responsible for ensuring the safety of new drugs that are introduced into the market. And supposedly they had, one, done the clearing too rapidly, basically. They went through the testing phase too rapidly. And also they say that they did not do sufficient exploration of the psychological effects of the drug, which they say was pretty much just ignored. So based off of those allegations, they said that the FDA's clearance isn't the right word. I can't remember the proper word right now. Somebody in chat can help me out there. But they say that the FDA's clearance of the drug was improper and that it needs to be rescinded based off of the facts that they allege. And so that went before a court that was overseen by a judge that had been appointed by the Trump administration. And this particular judge in particular was noted to be very anti-abortion. He had a very strong public track record as being very against abortion. So the expectation is that he was probably going to rule in favor of the pro-life group. And he did. And so there was some question about whether or not he would ban the drug until the appeal could go through. Obviously it was going to get appealed. Everybody kind of expected that too. But it wasn't clear if there would be an injunction on the ruling or not. In other words, it wasn't clear if they would say, we don't know if this is legal or really, we don't know if the pro-life group is right or not yet, given that it's going to be appealed. But technically, we could assume that they're right and block the drug until final resolution of the case. Or we could continue to allow the drug to be sold. So there was a parallel ruling in a separate but related case up in Washington State or something. And they ruled that the drug would have to be allowed going forward. And that kind of contradicted for a while, but eventually the other court, that is to say, the Texas court, did allow the drug to continue to be sold. So that case has been appealed. It's going before the Supreme Court. I don't think there's been a ruling on that yet, but I think I saw a headline the other day too that were related to it that I haven't read yet. But that's the gist of it. The question is whether or not this drug is going to have to go through the process of being cleared by the FDA again, and that could take a very long time, depending on how much of the previous testing could be admissible and how much new testing they might have to do. I think the general consensus in the legal community is that it's mostly bullshit, because it's not necessarily unusual for the FDA to fast track a given drug. So, and also the drug was cleared 20 years ago, back in the 90s, and there hasn't really been any appreciable problems that have accrued from the drug being available. So it's not really clear that even if the drug actually had failed to go through the FDA properly, that there have been any significant negative consequences that have resulted from it. So there seems to be a lot of politics, in other words, involved. Given the judge in question and their background, and given the politically charged nature of the abortion debate in the United States, there seems to be a lot of politics involved in this particular case. But we'll see. I would prefer to give people the benefit of the doubt, but the last time I did, the Supreme Court ended up proving me wrong and banning abortion in half of the United States. So color me a little skeptical at this point as far as the impartiality of the judicial system. We'll see. We'll see where it goes, but that's the gist of it right now. There's been other news in the United States about, the sort of post-Dobbs abortion world in the United States. But I won't get into all of it right here. But yeah, that is an ongoing story. I forget sometimes that Roe v. Wade was overturned. That's just such a mind-boggling, significant change to the political landscape here in the U.S. And the ramifications so large, it's easy to forget sometimes that, oh yeah, I live in a very different country now. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes. So that is an evolving story, and I am taking notes on it. I am trying to kind of organize them into something that I can summarize and make inferences from. But for now, it's just a lot of random stuff happening in different parts of the country. None of it is necessarily surprising. A lot of it is just conservative states passing new restrictions and the Republican Party kind of struggling to figure out just to what extent they want to ban abortion. They want to ban it in a lot of cases, but sometimes there's disagreement about whether or not there should be exceptions, things like that. And that's created a lot of discontent and consternation among the ranks within the Republican Party that the party is kind of struggling to manage right now. Kind of a mess, but messy politics is very much the theme of America in the 2020s, so maybe no surprise.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues that we always fight about, so it's not really a surprise that it's an issue. It's going to keep going this way for quite some time.
Yeah, the bigger issue is that the change regarding the legality of abortion after the overturning of Roe v. Wade was so significant that we have not yet reached a new equilibrium. Mm-hmm. We were in what you might call an uncomfortable equilibrium in the Roe v. Wade America. But now that we're past that, we don't really have a new equilibrium that we can point to and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it going forward. And that's creating a lot of waves politically in the U.S. accordingly.
We had a nice viewer wondering why laying down personal arms is not as much of an issue in the U.S. as abortion is. That's a topic that we've talked about quite a bit in this segment, and how owning firearms is a major part of just an American's identity. Like from very early on, whenever the U.S. was fighting for its independence from the United Kingdom, basically the notion of having guns in your home meant that you could resist whatever government was oppressing you or whatever. With modern military tech, it doesn't quite line up the same way, but it does definitely make a population more difficult to subdue. But it's just a thing that is part of our identity, where people having guns is very normal. And most people who have guns don't use them. Do we have a gun violence issue in the US? Absolutely yes. Do people want to remove guns to fix it? Absolutely not. That's something where there's a lot of people who are interested in keeping their firearms. We do have the National Rifle Association, which is quite powerful in politics. And I would say even conservatives and progressives are not really trying to fight for taking people's guns away. It is sort of a thing that people will be spooked about occasionally of, oh, this new Democrat president is going to take our guns, but so far the government has not taken people's guns. And you are right that it's not really a topic that's brought up as much as something like abortion. It's not really a sticking point.
Yeah, that's more a problem on Reddit than anything. Yeah, given the political orientation of some social media websites, some issues of one kind or another can be overemphasized. Well, not necessarily overemphasized, but receive more attention than they do in the broader body politic. So if the only experience you have with American politics is, say, Reddit or maybe Donald Trump's social media site, you're not really getting an accurate reading of the broader American politics. So yeah, it's definitely an issue, but it's also one that has more complex dynamics than people either inside or outside the United States are generally willing to assign to it. Yeah, I think part of the confusion is that a lot of what animates people in the gun debate in the United States are like the big massacres. Understandably so. They're massacres. That's kind of what you would expect to happen. But at the same time, the solutions almost don't seem proportionate. Like if there's a series of gun massacres, in particular those involving like just children, you would think there would be a much more dramatic response than, say, asking for broader background checks. Like that's such a mundane bureaucratic solution to a seemingly such a dramatic problem. But in the United States, like Neuro said, pro-gun sentiment is sufficiently strong that banning guns outright is more or less off the table. You can have extensive restrictions, and that's more or less what people here debate, but people are going to have their guns. That's almost certainly going to be the case. And that's a problem because a lot of the worst incidences involving gun violence in the United States are not really the kinds of gun problems that are going to be solved by marginal or incremental solutions or bureaucratic solutions or what have you. Like, odds are there's going to be continue to be significant gun violence so long as there's guns. And since, like I said, since we are going to have them, we will probably still see significant gun violence for the foreseeable future, barring some kind of dramatic change in broader American society that can't be foreseen at this moment. So, if the gun debate in the United States is confusing to you, that's the main reason why. There is a detachment between the problems that spur people to get interested in the issue and the actual solutions that are viable.
Yeah, it's, I think, difficult to find a medium level adjustment to what we have going on.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying we should or should not implement stricter gun laws and whatnot. I'm not going to wade into the debate. I've seen chat melt down doing that before. I'm sure it already is. So I'm not going to dig into it. But, I just will say that it's kind of deadlocked right now, and there's probably not going to be a lot of change one way or the other. And that in so much as there will be change, either in favor of making guns more readily available to the public or in terms of making them less readily available to the public. The kinds of nihilistic, violence that we see, like with school massacres and stuff, that'll probably not be significantly impacted by that. I would not expect. A determined crazy person is very difficult to stop. I mean, that really should not be a controversial statement because we had this debate like 20 years ago during the War on Terror. Mm-hmm. I'm sure the older people, I guess most of the listeners are older. So I'm sure everybody remembers like all the debates about like terrorism and what can we do about terrorism? How do we stop terrorists? And tactically speaking, in terms of your ability to stop somebody who wants to murder other people and wants to acquire the means to do so and doesn't care whether or not they survive, that is almost impossible to stop at a tactical level. Mm-hmm. Like the best you can do is try to prevent it in the first place or try to catch them in the planning stage. Like those are pretty much your best bets. But beyond that, everything else is circumstantial. Like maybe you kind of catch them with the gun out in the open as they're approaching the target. Maybe you can get them there. Or maybe they do something stupid that gets them caught, But for the most part, like a determined gunman is just extremely difficult to stop. Mm-hmm. It sounds stupid, but, somebody else with a gun is probably about the only real defense there. Mm-hmm. Police obviously... Go ahead.
There have been a lot of other breakdowns of how mass media has a major impact on a lot of these actors where they feel like they have nothing left to lose and like going on a shooting spree is a way to get their name out there and be seen by other people. I think a lot of people might feel on some level kind of buried by the weight of society where they feel like they don't matter and no one cares what they think and maybe they feel marginalized in some way. And that's some response that people will maybe see other actors who do that and then get a lot of attention and think, oh, that could be me. I could be noticed and have a moment kind of thing, which is super dark and very unfortunate. And it kind of goes back to how we don't really fully understand social media and mass media in general and how they're being used against us. Like people aren't really trained with ways to protect their own mental state from doom scrolling and becoming radicalized by things online and just getting back to more normal conversations, because honestly, social media can hit people's buttons so hard that it is like using drugs. Like you can be addicted to outrage media. You can be addicted to like really insane conspiracy theories that get you really fired up. And to be able to moderate those things is really hard to do. In our discussion that we had with Eche Fatum on Thursday, talking about kind of what it means to be woke to both the left and the right, he did an experiment where he used 3 web browsers. One web browser was just him looking at things that he normally would look at. One of them, he tried to browse a bunch of conservative leaning stuff. And another one, he tried to browse stuff that was very progressive leaning. And he noticed that as you click into stuff, it recommends you more of the same type of content because it wants you to click more things, it wants you to like more things, and it tries to feed you what you want, which is going to automatically pull people toward radicalization because it's trying to get you the more and more dank content in that direction that you already want to hear. Most people, they want to hear someone who's a pundit from their side yelling about how right we are, how wrong and stupid they are, and how we need to stop the world from being brought to ruin by the opposing side. Because that makes you feel very correct and very smart. It would be really different if our browsers would say, okay, you browsed 4 liberal videos, now you browse 4 conservative videos, that kind of thing. We don't have any sort of even chance of moderating our own media intake. It naturally wants to feed us more of what we're already wanting to browse. So it causes people to go down some pretty crazy rabbit holes. And when you're going through school and stuff, at least when we went through school, there was no training or education about the impacts of using Facebook and Instagram too much and how it can warp your perspective of where you sit in your friend group and things like this. It's a totally different format of how we interact with each other, and it can be very, very unhealthy. So I would say that's a point of reflection for every single individual. Like, for you to be able to challenge your own beliefs is a very, very important and powerful move for you to just keep control over your own mindset. Because honestly, this outrage media can be very addicting. It does get people very fired up in a way that activates them, makes them feel a part of something bigger than themselves, makes them feel like they're a part of a tribe. And all of those things are very human impulses, but they're being delivered to us in a very unusual and modern way that we haven't really been able to protect ourselves against, I feel like.
Mm. Yeah, we haven't developed the norms necessary to kind of govern the impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would point out, too, that the FBI tried to create a profile of school shooters just based off of the record they had of, existing school shooters. And they said that there was no consistent profile that they could create such that they could be identified beforehand. School shooters differ just significantly in terms of motive, history, background, etc. So there's not like any single set of profile. There's not any single set of variables that you could use really to identify somebody as a likely school shooter. They tend to differ significantly in terms of any man, just everything basically. So I agree with you on the impact of social media and the role that it plays in making, well, maybe not incentivizing, into kind of luring people into a nihilistic mindset, shall we say. But there's almost invariably other factors at play as well. Mental illness could be one, media could be one. What's the copycat killings? That could be a factor. People wanting to be. I don't really think people want to be famous. I kind of discount that. That's kind of become the most popular amongst the broader public, but I'm pretty skeptical about that overall. But I don't doubt that just having seen other people do it has encouraged and inspired, so to speak, later shooters to emulate the behavior. Yeah, it's just kind of this. It's not a uniquely American thing. You actually do see it in some other countries, especially over the past 10 years. There's been a couple killings like that in Brazil. There's actually another one just recently. And then there was one in Russia in particular. I think a couple in Russia over the past couple of years. So it's rare. It's rare overseas, but yeah, the United States definitely leads the way on that. And it's just not entirely clear why. At least not yet.
Yeah, and it's not always best to be in first place at things.
Yeah.
Especially this one. Well, chat was asking earlier, was there anything that was good news or funny?
Oh, you guys. Actually, we're kind of nearing the end of the segment here, right?
Yeah.
We've only got, 15 minutes, something?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did have some kind of weird news lined up, if you're interested.
Yeah, let's get it.
Yeah, this is a story from a couple months ago, and it was just kind of on my list, but we never really got around to it. So imagine that you're just a regular guy living in Nigeria, and eventually you see an ad online asking for somebody to come work in London. And that's a good opportunity, right? You can make pretty decent. The guy is offering good pay, right? And in Nigeria in particular, right now, there's a lot of youth unemployment. It's really hard to make good money. So getting a job in the UK in which you're making like £10,000, £20,000, like medium wage, that's an awesome offer. So this guy says, yeah, I'm definitely interested. And so the employer pays for him to fly up. He goes there and meets him and says, hey, thank you for taking the job. The only catch is that the job was a little ambiguous, but like this guy didn't really care. He was like, yeah, fine, whatever you want. For median wage in London, I'll do whatever you like. So his employer said, thank you, and then drove him to the hospital. That was the first thing. And the doctor did like a physical. And so, that was a little weird, but the guy's like, okay, if that's what you need. And then the doctor started asking a lot of like unusually intrusive questions, and then particular questions about his organs, specifically his kidneys.
Oh, no.
And so that kind of set off some alarm bells. And he kind of went back to his employer at the hospital and was like, so what exactly am I doing here? And the guy said, don't worry about it. The operation will not be bad. You'll recover. You'll be fine. You just need to do this one operation and I'll give you the money and then we'll be fine. And pretty clear at that point what was happening, right? This was an organ trafficking case. And so then this dude, this Nigerian guy, in his 20s, is really in a difficult spot. Because on one hand, the money is really good, especially for like a young guy in Nigeria. But on the other hand, like this is going to be really bad for his health. Also, keep in mind that he doesn't really speak English, at least not very well. So if he pisses off his employer, then he's going to like take his passport and he's just going to be kind of stuck there. Mm-hmm. And so eventually he decides he makes the brave choice, shall we say, and he just runs out. He just runs out of the hospital, says, fuck this, I'm out of here. And he actually lives homeless on the streets of London for like a week or two after that, because he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't he doesn't know who he can go to. He doesn't entirely trust the police, because at that point he's basically like there illegally. And so he's just kind of afraid and alone, like in the middle of London. And eventually he decides like he doesn't have any other options, and he goes to the police and he tells them what happened, and they go and arrest this guy. And it turns out there's actually more to the case than just old-fashioned organ trafficking. It turns out that the guy that hired him had a daughter who was roughly the same age, who had a rare disease that was destroying, I think it was her kidneys, and she needed a organ transplant, but the list was so long that it was looking like she would actually die before she got the transplant. And so her father just went out and basically did whatever he felt he needed to do to find that organ transplant, up to and including conning this guy into involuntarily giving up his. And so her father now is very much in jail. I think he was a doctor too, or like a lawyer. He's some kind of like a middle-class professional type
Was
guy.
that a super felony as well?
A turbo felony?
Yeah, turbo felony.
I suspect so. Yeah, I suspect so. The London police were very interested. So that was a pretty bizarre story that stood out from the usual repertoire among the articles that I read. Let's see. We also had children murdering cats in New Zealand. That was a pretty interesting one.
Why?
So, like there's sometimes feral cats can be a problem, if they breed out of control. And New Zealand already has like problems with intrusive species, right? Mm-hmm. So apparently they'll have annual contests where people just go out and hunt and kill feral cats. But this year they were apparently having a children's contest in which children would go out and hunt and kill as many feral cats as they could find. And animal rights organizations were not amused by this. They were pretty quick to pipe up and make the point that children are probably not the best hunters in general, but especially with regards to animals that may be feral, but may also just be somebody's house pet.
That's crazy. I've never heard of shit like that before.
So the organizers conceded the point and decided to cancel the children's contest to murder cats. probably a good call.
Yeah. Jeez.
Oh God, did you hear about the suck my tongue story?
No.
No. You sound a little anxious saying that.
I'm just concerned about TOS. It's all. That's all.
Oh no, it's fine. It's just weird. Yeah, you might have actually heard about this and forgotten about it. It was definitely making the rounds on social media a couple weeks ago. This had to do with the Dalai Lama. Uh, let's see, he was doing like a meet and greet or some, I don't know, some public event, and at one point a boy came up to him and was asking if he could hug him. And so the Dalai Lama, let's see, let me check my notes here. The Dalai Lama motioned to his cheek and said, "First here." And so the boy kissed him on the cheek and gave him a hug. And so then after that, the Dalai Lama was holding his hand. And so then he pointed to his lips and said, "I think also here," quote. And so then he kissed the boy on the lips. And so then he put his forward to the boy's forehead. That is to say, his forehead. He touched his forehead to the boy's forehead. And then he stuck out his tongue and said, quote, "And suck my tongue," end
What the
quote.
fuck?
So at that point, people were laughing. The boy stuck out his tongue and withdrew a little, as did the Dalai Lama. So it's not clear if it was like a joke or a thing. I did read that like sticking out your tongue is like a way of greeting people in Tibetan culture. So make of it what you will, but the internet had a field day with that, as you can imagine.
That's fucking weird.
That was pretty much Reddit's consensus. That is a fucking weird thing to do with a child.
I've heard of the bisu. Like the bisu is really common in Europe, like Southern Europe and stuff, where it's one kiss on each cheek. Tongue sucking stuff, ain't never heard of that shit being normal. That's weird as fuck. Anytime you're involving mucous membranes, you got to be careful because it's also how diseases are spread. So stay safe, chat. What the fuck, Dalai Lama? What is that?
Yeah, it struck probably the vast majority of the human race as highly inappropriate at best. And there was a lot of skepticism about potential alternative motivations to the Dalai Lama's asking a child to, quote, "suck my tongue," end quote.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah, fun side note here. In the article I was reading about that, they had a little note about a previous controversy involving the Dalai Lama, in which he had to apologize. He's also apologized for the "suck my tongue" thing. He had to come out afterwards and do some damage control, obviously. But there was another incident he had to apologize for in which he was being interviewed by the BBC. And apparently at some point in the interview, the subject of whether or not there might be a future female Dalai Lama came up. And apparently he said that if there were a future female Dalai Lama, it could only happen if she were, quote unquote, attractive.
What? The Dalai Lama said that?
Dalai Lama said that.
What the
in
fuck?
an interview with BBC World News.
Jeez Louise. He's supposed to be a holy man or something, right?
Yes.
Jeez.
Yeah, he is.
He's coming across pretty worldly, making normal people seem well-adjusted.
That's a pretty good insult for a leader of his stature and caliber. He's acting very worldly.
He is. Jeez.
Yeah, you definitely run across some weird stuff in the news occasionally.
He has been, I think for at least most of our lifetime, he's been someone who's been pretty highly revered by a lot of people.
Yeah.
Even people who aren't practicing Buddhists or Tibetan Buddhists or whatever exactly his religious orientation is. But yeah, this is interesting shit that is not cool.
Yeah, I guess the request was for funny shit, if I recall. So this is more like just weird shit.
Yeah.
That's about all I had. We already talked about the Minecraft server.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a thing about an assassination in India, but yeah, we could kind of save that for next time. I was going to ask you, since we're at the end of the segment, have you seen the new episode of A Fox in Space?
A fox in space?
Yeah.
What is that?
Oh, okay. Well, you're in for a treat then, maybe. I mean, have you ever heard of Star Fox?
Yes.
You have. Okay. So there was a guy, an independent animator, who decided to animate like a 20-minute short back in whenever, like 2015, 2016. And it was really good. Like it was very stylish, well animated, good story, good voice acting. Like it was very impressive. And I think it was I think it was after that, maybe it was before, he started a Kickstarter to try to make some money so that he could produce a second episode. And for a long time, it was just off my radar, and I didn't pay any attention to it. I just assumed it had failed at some point. And then I think last week, he released episode two. It kind of popped up in my YouTube recommendations.
Hmm.
So my expectations were decent, but I was pleasantly surprised. It was very well made. It was twice as long as the previous episode.
Fox
Just
in
quality
Space,
stuff.
episode 2.
If you haven't seen episode one, I would recommend starting with that because that's also very good. But I think episode two is even better.
Huh. Yeah, 6 years ago, 3.2 million views. Cool.
Yeah, if you like sort of 80s themed Blade Runner type film noir, I don't know, it's like a mix of a lot of different things, but it's got a very powerful 80s feel to it. That's sort of the style. It's very much a departure from like the actual original content. You know, the Star Fox, the game was more like a sort of kids game. It's like an arcade game almost in terms of design. But the animated shorts are just really good. I really appreciate the craftsmanship. So high recommendation there if you ever have the time.
Interesting. Speaking of 80s, yesterday when we did the audio discussion with Fuzzy Cord, he did a lot of the same kind of synthesizer sounds, and a lot of them just sound distinctly 1980s range. And it's interesting how different audio cues can make us think of certain environments or situations. Like you can create spooky sounds, happy sounds, sad sounds, tension, all kinds of different stuff with audio equipment, and the way that you manipulate the sounds and kind of mangle them almost in certain ways. We talked about subtracting certain elements from the sound to make it sound a certain way, or distorting them in certain ways. It's very interesting. But yeah, the 80s was definitely a period where there was a lot of like futuristic looking stuff, and that's been coming back with like the cyberpunk vibes in more recent years. Lots of neon colors and making things look really futuristic and whatnot.
Well, the really interesting thing about 80s style is that it was actually sort of retro futurism, like 50s culture and styles kind of became popular again in the 1980s as a sort of kind of throwback. And you can see that in a lot of the styles that became popular. And, you know, since then, they've evolved to the point where you don't really see the 50s much anymore. You just kind of think of it as 80s, but there's a lot of 50s influence there as well. Like the neon signs in particular, I think, are kind of a throwback.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the interesting realizations that I made, and we talked with Kukyo some about this, about how we've been born into a very futuristic time period relative to most of human history. Like the format of our lives and how we spend our time and the environments that we live in are dramatically different than before electricity, even before agriculture and stuff like that. We're a lot different in many, many ways. And it's something that gives us some very distinct advantages, which are great, and we get to enjoy, like being able to get the food that you need, like starvation and stuff. If you're in a developed country, you can usually find ways to get food and that sort of thing. Shelter is a lot more plentiful. The average violence between humans is a lot lower per person, which I think a lot of people forget about on a regular basis because we have so much news of people hurting other people, and now we have HD video of combat footage and all this kind of stuff. So the world looks very violent, and to an extent it is, but per person is less violent than it used to be when we lived in tribes and shot each other with arrows and huts and that kind of thing. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, interesting times. Hopefully the good kind and not the Chinese proverbial kind.
Yeah.
Definitely feels a lot of the time more like the latter than the former, but one must remain optimistic.
Yep. Well, cool. Appreciate you coming on as always. I will give you your regular 20-minute walk challenge for this week.
Oh, God.
I will be able to do an Agent Smith next Sunday, but probably not the Sunday after that because Trish will be visiting.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. You have a very saucy chat feed to read after I publish the VOD from today. I'll probably stream for a bit longer, but whenever I do publish that, yeah, you've got a lot of opinions that are being held very strongly.
Well, we definitely had some strong ones in the last YouTube video, so no surprise.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, you're just looking forward to it. I always appreciate feedback.
Yep. And if we got anything wrong, we welcome any feedback or scathing reviews in the YouTube comments. Thank you for contributing to the conversation, and we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. See you next time.
GG.